All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to the Scholar and Gentleman Study Pub and living rooms around the country, where we are discussing Brothers Karamazov, Book 5, Part 1, with a special emphasis on rebellion. These are the chapters where the book starts to get really hard and heavy. The kind of philosophical core of the novel, the reasons why people read this book, who are philosophers, critical theorists, theologians. This is where we get the biggest questions possible. Dostoevsky himself stated that his intention in writing this book was, one of his intentions anyway, was to make the strongest possible case against God and for God. And these are the chapters making the case against God. So I'm very excited to talk about this with everybody, get their reactions. I personally, this section of the book has haunted me for 10 years, maybe more. It's kind of my nightmare. I think any human being needs to wrestle with these questions. So I'm really excited to talk about it with you guys, get your perspectives. We're actually going to start, though, with the opening chapters, which are not as dramatic, but kind of cool in their own way, because we start to get a picture of some of the other side characters and a little bit more intimate familiarity with Alyosha and Ivan, which I think is really cool because they've not been really central characters so far. So let's start out with chapter 1, a betrothal, maybe a little surprise chapter here at Madame Koklakov's house. I love that. I love Madame Koklakov. She's like my favorite character. Very funny. And Alyosha, the monastery novice who's about to leave the seminary, is promising himself to like a 15-year-old girl or something like that. So here we go. Aaron, you must have a comment for this.
Nothing good. No, I did like, I think I had said before that Alyosha seemed kind of like a wallpaper or a side table for much of the early portion of the book. And he's starting to emerge as having some earnestness and some confusion. He's starting to get a little bit of depth. I appreciate reading kind of his earnestness and in his evolution here in the book.
And he even tells a lie like a real person.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. That he doesn't have the letter, right? That he doesn't have a love letter.
Already lying to the in-laws.
It's expected.
Well, the in-laws are already spying on him too.
This is probably going to need to wait till pure socialism time, but I do have a wonderful story that I need to share about a monk trying to get, engaged to a 15-year-old girl, but it does need, but please remind me later because you all are going to want to hear this.
All right, we'll save that for the parking lot. It's a book that's true to life, people. It's true to life. So
there's your case against God.
Oh boy!
All right, there has to. All right, let's get serious here.
Okay, am I the only one who actually thinks that the relationship between Alyosha and Lisa is really sweet? I mean, I know she's young.
Oh yeah.
But it's not creepy to me. Like it's coming across very.
Well, he's not all that old either.
Yeah,
Alyosha's not that much further off than. It doesn't.
I mean, when
like
my
it.
parents met, my mom was 16 and my dad was 20. It's not that much bigger of an age difference.
Yeah, they're what are they? They're 4 or 5, maybe 6 years apart, and she's kind of the girl next door that he grew up with, being childhood friends. So,
Which is how things work out in this day and age, anyway.
Yes.
It's also important to note that with some religious, and I'm not saying this is true for all religious, but I've met religious who are in their 70s who their emotional maturity never really got out of their teenage years. Like some of those nuns who are like super hardcore and want to hit their kids on the hands, So I think too, Alyosha, especially since he's been so sheltered in some ways and because he's so innocent, I don't think that they are on different emotional levels. I think that's really important to say, that like I don't think that those two intellectually and emotionally are on different levels.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, I don't think anyone is gonna say like this is like a disastrously sick or twisted thing here going on.
That's what I meant about the earnestness.
Okay, and I, because I'm a big dork, just
Like this isn't a creeper story.
Sorry,
Because- Because I'm a big dork, I just did some Googling to figure out when you could get married in 19th century Russia. And for a woman, you had to be 16 years old. And for a man, it had to be 18-year-old as of 1830. So she's actually
than I
only a
would've
year
expected.
away from being able to get married.
And it's almost an expected 2-year gap between the twixt of them, like at the youngest age of both. Be like an 18-16 split.
he's probably
Anyway, so it's
very
not creeper,
fairly,
at least in this context.
Until
Yeah.
1830, women could get married at the age of 13. So again, this is just one of those, I think as readers and now we find it's creepy, but like, when is this, 1880s? I'm just saying it's like 50 years ago, people were getting married at 13. So, 16, you're doing okay.
She's really of age at this point.
Okay, so we've established
But
it's not super creepy. I'd like
But she
to
hasn't
go out
gone
of
to
their-
college yet. But no one goes to college. So it's,
All right, stop. I want to talk about the first thing they actually spend some time talking about together, because it's kind of like they get together and they both have feelings for each other, but you obviously can't talk about that, right? So talk about something else to get it, over the awkwardness. So what they end up talking about is one of the highlights of the last chapter, one of the most just crushing moments in the book, when Snegirov tramples on the money and throws it back in Alyosha's face. And so they start discussing that. And Alyosha says, this is the best possible thing that could have happened. This is the right way. It definitely is working out because he did that. I was curious to hear your reaction on Alyosha's read when he's like, no, this really did need to go this way. What do you think?
Alyosha's pretty convincing, frankly. His analysis seems pretty astute. Speaking as someone who has borrowed money from friends and lent money to friends, there's all sorts of complicated emotions that go along with it. And I think Alyosha is explicit about the fact that, like, I probably played that wrong. I didn't, it would have been better if I had thought about this ahead of time. But at the end of the day, he needed time to, he needed a way to retain his honor and still get the money. It seems pretty on point.
Yeah, I really like Alyosha's optimism in it. Like, maybe I messed this up, but maybe it's still going to work out okay, and this is how it can all work out okay. I'm kind of worried it won't. But I don't know, because I haven't read the book before. But I really do appreciate his optimism and the way he's thinking through it.
I mean, I think he's trying to have a learning experience through the filter of what his elder has taught him, and being out in the world, and now dealing with these hindrances and actually dealing with humans in practice. So I think obviously he screwed up, but I think he's trying to make the best out of it, which is laudable.
Mm-hmm.
Emily, you've joined the conversation. Hello.
Hi.
It's so good to have you.
Good to be here.
So right now we're discussing the chapter of betrothal and Alyosha's relationship with Lise, and their initial conversation about Captain Snegirov and his rejection of the money, where Alyosha puts this, as someone else said, very optimistic spin on what happened.
Right.
That he had to reject it. Like, it gave him a chance to prove his honor, but now maybe he'll be able to accept the money, on a second pass.
Mm-hmm. While still saving face.
Yeah. So one interesting thing I noticed in this conversation is how Lise comes back at a certain point. She's very taken by his explanation. I think she views him as a little bit more mature, a little bit more insightful in other people's character, and she's like, "Wow, that all makes sense." But aren't we being a little like contemptive of that guy? Is it like wrong of us to, think that we understand all his? Did you guys notice that moment?
Absolutely. And that was the one moment in this chapter that I kind of flagged as, thematically that keeps coming back. I accidentally read ahead. I didn't realize we were only doing the first few sections this week. But that idea of kind of reducing other people to, putting other people in a box in the way that you can understand them is a thing that comes back a whole bunch for the next 50 or 80 odd pages. It's a question that maybe Alyosha's answer, I'm only acknowledging in him the same weaknesses that I see in myself, is good enough for, but there's a lot of debate still to be had.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a pretty deep comment. Like, just kind of thinking about like how we can't really see like everything that is existing is like a great thematic point to kind of like read into the rest of it. Like, I think that's the whole point here in what we're discussing tonight. Like, we can't see all ends, and like things are bigger than we can ever imagine, and like to be limited in this little box is kind of tough. I don't know. I won't talk anymore about this, but that's my initial reflection.
I think Michael's onto something. I think that, and I could be reading too much into this too, but I think that Liza's comment in some ways is foreshadowing the conversation between Ivan and Alyosha that's coming on the heels of this. Because Alyosha, when he says, okay, well, it didn't go well at first because I made a mistake, but it's going to go great tomorrow, he strikes me with a person who, I don't want to say Alyosha is a fatalist because I think that's kind of a bit too far, but I think because he's so in every moment of his life completely resigned to the idea of providence, he thinks that what happened and couldn't really have happened any other way. And so he's kind of living in a certain kind of certainty of, things are going to work out for the better. And his statements about how things are going to go well or why things are going to go the way they are, and his assessment of the situation is largely based on his faith. And then therefore you have that kind of one enlightened question coming out of nowhere that goes, but are you sure about that? Because it seems that, because I think that there's a sense that his belief about the person's motives and what that person can see, these are conclusions that he's drawing because he already has certain premises he's assuming. And so I think that in a kind of a subtle way, I feel like the idea of how belief in a certain kind of result and how faith in a certain kind of result is going to be the lens that then interprets a person's vision of the world. And so to say, isn't it arrogant of us to see it that way, to see a person in that way? I don't know. I feel like it was a real clever lead in to what's coming.
And it just seems like Lise has a good read on, well, let's not overstep what we know. And I mean, just a certain like pull back to earth instinct of, if we think we know this much about someone, are we actually looking down on them a little bit because we can predict everything? I don't know quite how to put it, but I thought it was a nice like moment of reining in a little bit. I appreciate all your thoughtful responses to that one. I'm going to move on to a slightly lighter subject for a second. for this chapter, and then we'll move on to the next.
This whole discussion is not going to be lighter. I'm sorry.
Oh boy.
This part is.
Oh, I got that fun Turkish baby story.
I'm wondering if the rest of you enjoyed this sort of playful back and forth between Alexei and Lise as much as I did. Kind of like, well, tell me, what clothes are you going to wear in the world? You need to wear like this suit and this particular hat and all this stuff. And will you obey me? Like, and this is really interesting, playful back and forth. And like, kind of like, well, did you believe that I didn't love you this morning when I told you to announce the letter? And he says, no, I didn't believe you. And then she's like, oh, you incorrigible man, you're even worse. Like, you know, like I found that really charming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in full disclosure, when you said that you could jump in with just these chapters if you haven't had a chance to read the rest of the book, that's me right now. So, so I started with this chapter like having no idea who these people are in the greater context of the book, but yeah, I found myself being really charmed by their relationship and the way they interact with each other. I don't know. It's like you could tell they've been friends for a long time. Like they're really comfortable teasing each other. I don't know. I thought that was fun. But like I said, I didn't read the other earlier parts, so maybe I'm misjudging things.
No, I don't think you're misjudging. I mean, what we know of them so far is they grew up together and she's been teasing him throughout the book. Really cute relationship. Yeah, I also really enjoyed their little back and forth. I don't know that I have anything insightful to say about it, but I enjoyed it.
No, I mean, it's just one of the more lighthearted and kind of funny sections of the book. And I think that's worth mentioning because it's like, let's talk about death and God, but also like, you know, people are having fun.
Does anyone else like get the idea that like Alyosha is kind of like a counterpoint to like reality or something like that?
What do you mean, Michael?
Like I feel like Alyosha is like this little like perfect thing, and like this whole relationship is like this other little perfect thing, and then like we get the mess of all the other characters. Like there's this like counterpoint of like maybe how things should be or something like that.
Is it that, or is it like too good to be true?
Yeah,
You're
maybe
saying?
that too. Like maybe that's part of it. I don't know. Like maybe it is too good to be true, or maybe they're just like too perfect, or maybe that's the way it's supposed to be in like the author's mind or something like that. And like here's the mess and counterpoint to this. I don't know. I'm just kind of throwing that out there. I'm not trying to make a point or anything, but just wondering.
I don't think they're too good to be true, because I mean, let's not forget that Lise is confined to a chair because she can't walk, and she has a significant disease that they've been going to Father Zosima hoping for a miracle cure. And Alyosha is currently trying to wrangle his insane brothers after being abandoned by his father and having his mother die. I'm just saying, like, I get that there's like a sweet romance, but I still don't feel like their stories being set up as like they have a perfect life. Like both of them have a lot of problems. So I think that's almost, to me, that's where it becomes there's a good thing in the midst of all the ruin. It's not like that's why to me it's not too good to be true. It's like maybe there's a way for Alyosha to find the good things even when everything is pretty effed up.
Well, is Alyosha the beacon that everyone's trying to find? It's like maybe this is me speaking out loud and thinking out loud, but like is he just like the beacon that everyone's supposed to trying to find, and like this is like the central point of like consonance versus like dissonance or something? I don't know.
Well, I have two comments. Oh, sorry, Ginny, go first.
Okay. Well, I was gonna say I see Alyosha as really striving to overcome and to be above and to be the good example, but struggling with it as well. Not that, he is automatically or always, above or better than, because he keeps saying, I too am a Karamazov. I too feel this, but he's really striving and struggling to be better than. Not better than like in a pretentious way, but like to be better.
That was much better than what I was going to say, which is that I kind of get a sense that things come too easily to Alyosha sometimes. He has this sort of angelic nature. People love him automatically. He seems to have good inclinations. But as you've just pointed out, he is constantly striving and trying to overcome opposite tendencies in himself. And other people maybe can't see it, but he keeps making us aware that there is this struggle in him. So I think you said that much more insightfully than I was going to. And just to go way back, Aaron, I hope you had a Stephen Wilson moment when Michael said a perfect life.
Yes, obviously.
Good. Sure. Okay.
I can't tell if he's being sardonic or serious when he says I'm a Karamazov. I don't. Sometimes people denigrate themselves to to be humble. Sometimes people are providing insight into themselves, and I can't really tell yet what his.
I read that as being totally serious. I see that as something that he's afraid of in himself. Like, as was pointed out, he can be, whether it's providence or something else, he can be a bit of a fatalist. And I think part of him is terrified that he has this darker nature in him, that's some sort of inheritance that he has. And he's kind of afraid that that's going to catch up with him at some point, and he's trying to avoid it.
Yes, and those of you who weren't here last week, we learned that Karamazov etymologically means the black smudge, or sort of like the black stain. So I do think he's a little afraid of that. But to Aaron's point, well, we'll find out as it goes on. I think Alyosha tends to be pretty earnest.
I'm waiting for that shoe to drop if that's the case, because they are setting him up as so innocent.
Right.
So.
I just don't know. Like, is it just like this literary thing, or is he like kind of developing his character? Or is it like this like counterpoint where this character has to he's like this naive character that has to come to terms with a whole bunch of filthiness or something like that that has to come to terms with that and adapt it into his perfection, and then coming from the Orthodox perspective, this perfect being or something like that is this is basically what a saint should be. He's struggling, he's trying to get better, and he's not perfect on his own, but that's not what saints are anyway. But is it set up to fail, or is it set up to something else? I don't know. I'm just kind of wondering in advance and kind of seeing this play forth as he encounters all these things. And if we're talking about saints and monks and everything else, monastic kind of he hasn't been officially taken vows as a novice, I don't think. No. But he's kind of close there, and he's kind of turning. He's kind of going to 180 here. It's a kind of large departure from his monastic novice things. If you're intending to get married, you're not going to be a novice for any term at all, ever. So
can I just interject? Doesn't he say at one point that his elder ordered him to leave?
Yes, so let's not forget that this is on Elder Zosima's orders and actually contrary to Alyosha's plan for himself, in which he's grieved. So this is a surprise to him to return and enter the world. Although I think all the rest of Michael's points were absolutely great questions to think about as we go forward.
Oh, definitely.
like this innocence we see in Alyosha, is it and not just the innocence, but this awareness of the other side. Is this going to play out towards his fall, or is this the thing that gives him strength and makes him different, and to be emulated? So I think we can even begin to talk about that in the future chapters today, where he begins to converse with Yvonne. So let's move on from this first chapter.
Could I add one more thing?
Okay, yes.
So it's the one book that could really help us understand this. I know that I'm not trying to get too far afield, but Dostoevsky's The Idiot is also structured exactly what Michael's Taggy's point about counterpoint, because in that book you have a very Christ-like character, and the whole nature of the drama is that nobody knows what to do with the Christ-like character walking around, and the whole book is kind of structured around the craziness of you actually have someone who is a prince and yet is holy and sincere and earnest and wants to help everybody, and nobody knows how to handle it. So I think as far as the questions moving forward, if you have this angelic character, I think the thing to be looking toward is not always just, will this work out, will this not work out for the character, but what is it about this character that this really crappy world that he's the counterpoint to can't seem to be able to adjust to? Why is it that they can't seem to get on board with this character? Why does it never fit? Because that's a continuous, because almost all of the Christ-like characters in Dostoevsky's writing, the whole structured around, just can't seem to get on board, but they just can't get it.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful, because I think most of us have never read the rest of Dostoevsky. So, this is kind of his final statement, but there were problems he was working out in earlier novels, and undoubtedly some of those themes are playing out here. So I appreciate that insight. I'd like to move on to the next chapter, Smerdikov with the guitar. I find this to be a pretty interesting chapter in that we get a sort of psychological deep dive in a way into Smerdikov. We get to see him kind of hanging out in his normal environment and doing what he does. He's playing guitar and singing to this girl that seems to be very interested in him, and he doesn't seem to be the least bit interested in her. The thing I take away from this chapter, I guess, is how deeply wounded he seems to be and how bitter. He seems a very tragic character to me, in that he's just had a really hard life. Even when he tried to go to Moscow and make his way as a cook, somehow his reputation preceded him. And they say specifically it came through Grigory Vasilyevich, his kind of foster father, somehow let it be known that this guy is a bastard child born of, stinking Lizaveta, and things didn't go well for him. So he dresses himself up and he combs his hair really well and has shiny boots and hates the world and wants to get out of Russia and go to France, and I just found that all very it's hard to like Smerdikov, I think, but I feel really bad for him.
Yeah.
I have no idea what to make of this guy.
Yeah.
I feel like he tries too much. Like he just kind of externalizes his worth.
This makes sense where he comes from.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, on that note, I forgot a comment I wanted to make in the last chapter about Lise and her promise that she's gonna I'll marry you, but just know I'm gonna sift through your drawers and spy on you and listen to you and stuff. And I was just like, well, that's okay, but it's not very good, But I think in the last chapter you can kind of see the crazy oppressive mother having the effect on the daughter pretty clearly, right?
You know how many girls have gone through my phone?
No. Does anyone have any thoughts or insights to share on the Smerdikov chapter?
I suppose only only that I think his weird kind of resentment about not being appreciated for his intelligence is noteworthy. He's annoyed that Dmitri, who's dumber than he is, gets advantages, and of course, like Ivan brings up, the community of intelligent people repeatedly over the course of his conversation with Alyosha. Also, so it's a good thing to keep an eye on.
Well, I wonder if it's just like a question of like not knowing people, like kind of preface, like not knowing people, kind of throwing it out there.
Like Smerdikov doesn't have the connections to get stuff done?
Like no one knows him.
Mm-hmm.
Like everyone kind of resents him. Like everyone kind of throws him into this like, well, you're just like the bastard child of like some sort of thing, but like he is very intelligent. Like, I mean, it's not well developed, but like he is intelligent. Like, he tries to
specialité.
Yeah, he's just a cook, but he thinks higher than a cook, and like everyone kind of just like, well, you're just a dumb cook. Like why should we listen to you? Like that's kind of his role.
His own foster father, in the previous book, insulted him with the epithet "broth maker," if you remember that, in the midst of their dispute. The point that kind of struck me in this chapter about just how stuck and resentful and hopeless he feels is on 224, when this young lady he's singing to is praising him for his verse, and he's saying it's basically nonsense. And she says, well, you're so smart. How did you ever amount to all that? And then he says, I could have done even better, miss, and I know a lot more if it wasn't for my destiny ever since childhood. This next line really struck me. I'd have killed a man in a duel with a pistol for calling me low-born because I came from stinking Lisaveta without a father, and they were shoving that in my face in Moscow. It spread there thanks to Grigory Vasilievich. That's a passing moment, and I think maybe we don't hear what that means in our day and age, but I think what he's saying there is, I would challenge these people who insult me to a duel, but based on his status in society, no one would ever accept his challenge. He's so low that it's a joke. Like, no, I'm not going to duel with you, and that's ultra humiliating.
Yeah, I was picking up on some definite class distinctions and commentary in this chapter. And I think that can be something that, as modern Americans, can sometimes be difficult for us to comprehend. But the class distinctions in Europe during this period were very rigid. And so, like, he's like some kind of servant to the family.
Right.
Is that what I'm getting? And then when Alyosha finally has to reveal himself and see the people, it's revealed that the lady is the landlady's daughter, who's also this very working class person, not very high in society. And it says she's wearing a light blue dress with a train 2 yards long. And Smerdikov himself is all, dressed up and pomaded, and it's almost like they're playing dress up. It's like they're playing at being a lady and a gentleman, like these fancy highborn people, but they're really not. And I think, yeah, go on.
Well, I was just gonna say that I don't know if we have one who she was working in Moscow, but she came home because her mother is bankrupt, and so now they're relying on the Karamazov family for food. But she can like they make fun of her because she continues to wear her high class Moscow dresses. So I think she's totally playing a kind of dress up, like refusing to let go of this role that she had.
Is that the
I didn't mean to
landlady's
interrupt you.
daughter?
I just felt like even though I haven't read those chapters, you whole trajectory that we heard about where she like everyone's like, why does she keep wearing these clothes that are above her station, but she just can't let go of this role she used to have, even though she's fallen to this new role.
And I think she's they're both kind of clinging to an image of who they would like to be, who they'd like to be perceived as. But I think she's a lot more optimistic about it than Smerdyakov is. I think I don't know.
I wonder if it's like Smerdyakov is like kind of coming up from the lower class, shooting highward, and she's coming from the higher, kind of fallen to a lower state, but still like kind of retaining that anchor in the higher state, and like kind of she doesn't necessarily identify with being the lower state that she currently is. Like it's like kind of like an illusion to her. And then Smerdyakov, on the other hand, is like kind of seeing this higher state, and it's almost like another illusion on the other side.
See, I didn't read it that way at all, because if she's a landlady's daughter, she's not coming from high class.
Well, the landladies, though, I wonder if perhaps I'm wrong, but I think the landladies and the landlords on this like feudal-esque system were like the higher class.
Well, this is Emily. We had information in previous chapters about these people, and they did come from a better position and fall from it. So there is that element. But she's hanging on in a kind of like comical way. Like she's wearing 2-yard trains and then going to their neighbors to get broth,
Which is coming from the higher perspective, going lower, and he's going from the lower perspective, going higher. And it's like kind of like this weird counterpoint where they meet in the middle. That's what I see. I don't know. We can kind of delve into the details there, but that's what I see in this this dialogue here. You got the runt and like the diminished landlord.
I also get the sense that she's very young, that she's some sort of teenager, like, and she seems kind of giggly. But I think what's interesting.
Well, I think that's where the intersection can actually happen, is where like the differences in like states are less rigid.
I personally wonder if Smerdyakov has been so wounded that he can't really have a romantic interest in anybody, and that's part of what this chapter is about. I don't know, like, or is it just this is the overeager girl that's like, here's a smart guy for the first time, that maybe pays attention to me. But
I kind of wonder if it's like it's almost like Smerdyakov is like a ruined character in a certain sense. Like he's like aiming for something that's completely unattainable, because here he is, but like trying to get like the affirmation from the higher class, and here he has it from the higher class, although they're kind of a ruined and different higher class, and they're kind of going down. But it's like kind of the same sort of principle. I don't know. Does that make sense to anyone, or am I kind of speaking weird?
No, that makes sense. I was about to say the same thing. I mean, why is he playing this love song apparently to this girl he doesn't even seem to like? I mean, he's just soothing himself, looking for that affirmation.
But then she's providing it to him.
Yeah.
And she's from the higher class officially. But like his whole goal is to like get affirmation from the higher class, but here it is and it's presented to him and he's like rejecting it.
But isn't there
In
something
some
kind
ways, it's beneath. I think Ginny's talking.
It was me. I was gonna say, isn't there something kind of satisfying in that? Like,
Like maybe it's the exact same like counterpoint to like Sniggy.
Let's hear Emily.
like if you're bitter about being despised by people, there can sometimes be a sort of satisfaction in seeking attention from someone like that, getting it, and then throwing it back in their face. You know, like, yeah, I don't need your attention. You know, you're not that important.
Mm-hmm.
You're not
That's so Dostoevsky. Oh my God, that's so Dostoevsky. It just blew my mind.
I think
Isn't it Sniggy? All
You
over
haven't
again?
even read the last chapters, but that's exactly what Captain Snegurov did in the last chapters, which is a big mind-blowing moment. Like, whoa. Also, I was going to say, perhaps for Smerdikov, I mean, his ambitions are to get out of this shithole and, like, be part of enlightened Europe, not crappy Russia. And this girl is basically a symbol of crappy Russia. You know, like, here's this another thoughtless, dumb girl. So I don't know if that's part of it. Like, but he just doesn't seem to care about it at all. We spent a lot of time in this chapter. I want to move on because the focus this week should be Ivan and Alyosha's conversation. We spent a whole hour talking about the other characters because I think they're fascinating. But let's move on to the meat. So the brothers get acquainted, chapter 3. This is a chapter that kind of comes out of left field. Like, all of a sudden, Ivan is really effusive. Like, he just broke up with Katerina, and he seems to be on a bit of a high. And I thought it's actually fascinating to listen to him suddenly open up, share his heart, pour it out, speak freely. He shows affection to Alyosha. And one of the first things he does in that chapter, page 230, he gives this kind of long, rapturous speech about how much he loves life and how he's going to, even if he loses hope in the order of things and everything else, he's got enough like power of love and life to sustain him until at least age 30.
It's all over.
And I have to say, did you guys think of Dmitri when you read this page? Because I can't help but hear Dmitri's confessions chapters where it's like, 1 minute I'm on top of the world and, you know, ode to joy, glory, glory. And the next minute it's like, dash the cup, despair of life, you know, and everything's terrible. I just think we're seeing this side of Ivan that's been really covered up, but it's like the guy has a beating heart. He really does feel things deeply. He's a young man. He was deeply in love. He was really hurt. And he's in this kind of like, I just broke up sort of like rebound spree. And I think it's kind of cool to see him in this moment. But I thought he is not that different from Dmitri. He really has a lot of similarities. Did you guys notice that? What do you think?
Oh, I agree completely. I also think it's important to see how all of these chapters are set in order intentionally. I mean, I love Taggy when he likes to use the word counterpoint, because that's the way the chapters are set up. All these different characters and how they're reacting. We have 3 different sets of relationship that are being put side to side to side. You have Katerina and Ivan, you have Smerdikov and the girl, and then you have, you know, Alyosha and Lies. And they're all presented next to each other for a reason. And they're trying to kind of see, well, what are these all have in common? What makes them completely different? And in that moment, it's like, wow, in this moment, Ivan is both a little bit like Smerdikov and Dmitri, like Dmitri with the intense emotion, but also that satisfaction of rejection, right? Like, because as we talked about last week, Karamazovs do not like manipulation. They do not like to be the object of someone else's pawn. No one in their pride does. And it's always better to be the one dropping than to be dropped. And that's Smerdyakov's life story, right? He's always been dropped. He's always been rejected. He's always been the rejection that defines him. So if anything, Smerdyakov can have that little bit of satisfaction in at least once I'm doing the rejecting. And in the same way, I think there's some relief in Ivan's exaltation right now, right? Like, because I like the way you said it, like he's exulting in power. And I think that the whole thing that's being set up here in these three relationships is the dynamic of power and love. And they're being set up as cross purposes. Those two things are being essentially set up as cross purposes, the power dynamic versus the love dynamic. The idea of
blowing my mind in seeing these like moments where people seize an opportunity to reject someone for a need. And I hadn't made that connection here with Ivan.
Well, rejection is power.
We just talked about it with Smerdyakov. We talked about it with Snegurov.
Right, and Alyosha's supreme love is his willingness to put himself under Liza's power. That's the key, right? That's the counterpoint that Taggy's after. And so like that's the kind of the whole thing that's going on. So it's funny because even though these chapters, even though they're set up to be about death and God and good and evil, they're actually always trying to be filtered. These big questions are being filtered through the lens of relationships. Even in these early chapters where you think we're about to get to the big questions, Dostoevsky is trying to help us understand these big questions are best understood through the lens of relationships.
Yes.
I just love that. I mean, up to this point in the book, it seems like Ivan has been real mystery. Dmitri says of him, Ivan is a grave, and Alyosha says Ivan is a riddle. And in this chapter, Ivan just lays his heart bare, and I just love that. Like, suddenly I relate to this guy, and I've always kind of shared his questions and his searching and stuff, but it's really nice to see this passionate moment emerge with Katerina, where he's like, I did love you and you scorned me, and and then this kind of giddiness of like, I broke up with her, she didn't break up with me, like and then a sudden outpouring of affection for Alyosha. It's like he's been so preoccupied with this, am I going to win the girl or not? That for 4 months or whatever, he's been ignoring Alyosha. And then all of a sudden, he really wants to get to know his brother. And I think that's kind of striking.
That's the relief, right? Like, Ivan floods open to Alyosha because he realizes in that moment that this is the one person where there are no power games. This is the one person where like that completely is out the window, and he can finally share his mind.
I almost wonder if it's like Ivan here is almost like this is me like kind of blowing things up again, but like Ivan was all of a sudden like a microcosm of her life. Like here he is like completely constrained with the effort of going after this girl, and that's been taken away, and all of a sudden like his mind gets opened up to something else, like, and now he's got to ponder like the deeper things of life. I don't know.
I have two questions for people about this particular little speech. The sticky little leaves and dashing the cup and all that stuff. So what do you guys think he means by the cup? Like, until 30, I'm good, and then I'll set the cup aside. What is he talking about? Is he talking about sensuality? Is he talking about just pleasure in life? Is he talking about I'm going to commit suicide at 30? What is your take on that? Because I don't really know what he means by, I'm good until 30 and then toss the cup.
At first, I thought he meant just that innocent, childlike state of just, enjoying the budding spring leaves and the blue sky. But then he makes reference to, his father's remarks about like, I'm going to keep this thing going until I'm 70 or 80. And that was what, Over Cognac? That was the last book, wasn't it? And he's referring specifically to his debauchery there. So at first I was thinking it was that innocent enjoyment of life, but then when he referred it back to Fyodor, I was thinking, oh, he's going he means the sensuality. That's what I ended up thinking when he related it back to his father.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, like, does he mean at 30 I'll become a decent human being and restrain my passions, or I'll just give up on life altogether because I've taken in the passions of youth, and beyond that it's not worth it. I don't know what to take there.
Yeah.
The way I read it, so hang on, let me find the line. Until my 30th year, I know this for certain, my youth will overcome everything, all disillusionment, all aversion to life. And then he talks about despair. So I kind of read it that, like, after 30, he expects to be disillusioned with life. Like, not necessarily I'm going to commit suicide, but just kind of like, maybe I won't have the same love and joy that I have now. Or maybe I won't have the same. And I'm not quite sure how that relates then, like you said, when it goes back to comparing it to his father, where it seems to be more like how his father talks about still having sex with women until he's 80 years old.
Right, like it seems like his father is like superbly like able to put aside the disillusionment of life for like the temporal passions or something. I don't know. I'm not quite sure how that
Yeah,
works.
I mean,
Like he's going to finally address it at 30, or like it,
yeah, it could mean he thinks his father isn't kind of facing that disillusionment.
like is his father like the imbecile or something like that? Is that what he's trying to say? Like his father is just like this idiot that just like won't like address like the state that he's in and like come to grips with reality, or I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's definitely an interpretation of it. I don't know for sure, but
I mean,
yeah,
it
I
seems
read it
kind
more
of
as
serious. Like I don't know. I think the easiest way for me to put it was like I'm gonna like punch off if I'm not good by 30. Like I'm just gonna enjoy life how it is, and just like if it's not good, like I'm out of here. That's kind of how I took it, but I don't know.
Did anyone else get a little scared by this, by being over 30?
Yeah. Yeah, speaking as a 30-year-old, exactly. Yeah, for me, I took it similarly. I think, although ever so slightly different in that I'm gonna try to take this stuff seriously until I'm 30. I'm going to let myself be bothered by the way that the world is, and as he goes on by this flaw in the world, and try to. And if I haven't figured it out by that point, my sort of like youthful love of life will no longer be able to sustain me in maintaining this tense way of being in the world that that is important to me. This like constant rebellion. So at that point, I was taking it as like I'm gonna like go get a day job, but maybe suicide, you know.
All right. Well, we'll have to see what happens. I'm not quite sure what to make of that statement, and I've read the book a lot of times. So,
Can I contribute something on this? This is not me. This is like what other scholars write about it. A lot of scholars think this has to do with Dostoevsky's influence by Schopenhauer, who basically said that nature tricks people until they're 30 to think the world is wonderful, even though the world is shit, and they're really passionate, they really enjoy life. Then it tricks them into having a bunch of kids and getting really engaged in life, and then they're trapped. And then when they're 30, they realize they're trapped into having to clean up all the things they did when they were.
Schopenhauer was real fun at parties.
Then they're 30 and they realize they're trapped into being a first grade teacher assistant.
so this is the midlife crisis theory of Dostoevsky. I'm going to ask a question. I think this is a very minor point, but I found this really interesting. So Ivan says he really wants to travel to Europe, this really echoes Smerdyakov, who's like, I'm out of this stupid country. Let me go somewhere enlightened. But Ivan has this interesting comment. Is like, I'd like to travel Europe. I'm really excited about it, but it's a graveyard. And even knowing that, I'm going to go and kiss the graveyard. What does he mean by Europe as a graveyard? Did you guys get any? I don't know what he's talking about for sure. I'm not sure if he's saying like they've had these brilliant intellectual movements, but ultimately they're empty. Or Europe used to be a bastion of faith, and it's nice to see people who used to believe something, but I don't, but it's still beautiful. What did you guys take by that?
I think it's more the latter. He's seeing like Europe as like this. Well, you were great, and I'm gonna go visit that and kind of venerate it, and that's what I'm going for.
Yeah.
I figured it was the cultural and historical, intellectual track because of who Ivan is.
Yeah.
Like it's dead, but I'm just gonna go and venerate it anyway because like that's what we do.
It doesn't
like,
have to
there's
be
really nothing important anymore. Like I've gotten everything I got, and everything is dead. Everything is dead to me. Everything's dead to me, and everything's dead to my thoughts and Europe and everything else. It's just all dead. So
We all,
graveyard. And what do? You go visit the graves.
we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? I mean, from Greece to Rome to all the people he's referencing. I mean, it could be an opposite meaning in terms of like, this is from whence everything comes, and I want to,
pay my respects.
partake in that.
I definitely also was thinking of like Greece and Rome, and just this idea that the greatest thinkers of art, we still think of that in Western society, that kind of the Greeks and the Romans are kind of where it all came from. But those civilizations, as they were, are long gone.
I just thought it was a bit odd because, like the ideas with which I guess I assume Ivan identifies seem to be the more revolutionary, modernist ideas coming out of exactly those countries that he's talking about, and absent in Russia, which is backwater hillbilly, right? So it's just an interesting contrast with Smerdyakov's view, where like Europe equals the promised land, and Ivan's view of Europe is like, this place is already dead, but I want to go and venerate it. And maybe that's enough said on that topic, because we got much bigger topics to discuss. So
Counterpoint.
I am seeing lots of freaking out with the microphone. I don't know, a few of you guys, if you could like silence your mics when you're not speaking so that the video isn't flashing around everywhere, that might help. I want to move into the deeper stuff. I'll just invite, I guess, one more open mic for anybody for comments of Alyosha and Ivan's meeting kind of in this restaurant. Any other comments before we get into Ivan's rebellion chapter?
Yeah, I have just one. At the top of page 234, Ivan's talking to Alyosha, I'm exactly the same little boy as you are, and about how are Russian boys handling these questions. And I think it's very interesting. And the chapter in fact, their whole conversation starts with Alyosha saying something about like, I'm realizing how young we still are and how green we still are. So I wanted to point out that they're approaching these things with this idea of their youth and their greenness.
I also noticed that one of the quotes or one of the passages I've seen most quoted from this book is where Ivan at the bottom of page 235 starts going off, I have a childlike conviction that the sufferings will be healed and smoothed over, yada, yada, yada. I've seen that quoted a lot, but never in the context of Ivan saying, I accept God, but I don't accept this ending to everything. I thought that was interesting because I often see it quoted by, there's a famous, well, not famous, but there's a well-known Orthodox blogger, Stephen Freeman. He's a priest in our diocese, and he writes a well-known blog. I think I've seen him quote it, but you never see it quoted in the context of Ivan being like, I reject this. I kind of had the question is that what Dostoevsky believes? Is that what he's hoping for? He lays it out there in a very beautiful fashion. And I'm kind of reading it and I'm like, oh, I like that vision, but Ivan's rejecting it. Perhaps Chris, somebody can speak to that.
Well, yeah, let me frame that, I guess. So Ivan's argument really begins in this chapter on page 234 and 235. That's where the meat begins. So you guys are starting to dig into that. I think this is just a fascinating section where Ivan starts to be like, let me show you who I really am. Let me lay my thoughts bare. And I will begin as stupidly as possible because that's the Russian way. And so I think this is just a fascinating argument. These 2 pages here, they're full of contradictions. I don't know if you guys noticed that, but I made actually a little list of everything that he asserts in these paragraphs. I'm just going to read them as kind of bullet points. So page 234 to 235, Ivan's fascinating opening argument as stupidly as possible. He says, man created God. Then he says, this is pretty surprising, and actually to man's credit, because he had such a noble idea for a wicked beast. It's a little surprised to see he come up with such a good idea. Then he goes on to say he accepts God pure and simple, which is like, what? I thought you just said man created him, but like he's not sure? I don't know. Then he talks a little while about the Euclidean mind. Like I see 3 dimensions. Parallel lines are parallel. I don't understand another logic, and I can't resolve questions that aren't of this world. Then he goes on to say, okay, let's say that God exists, and let's say, and this is a pretty bold conclusion. Let's say there's universal salvation. Let's grant cosmic restoration. Let's say everyone has a happy ending. There's actually a word for this in theology. It's called apokatastasis. And it's controversial, to say the least. Controversial position within Christian theology. He goes all the way to the happiest ending possible, which is pretty notable. Then he says, I don't accept God's world. I accept God, but I don't accept this world. It sucks, even with a happy ending. And he says a phrase that I think is key, where he says this happy ending somehow would justify everything that has happened with men. As though the happy ending can make sense of every terrible thing ever. He says that this is his confession of what he lives by. Then he points out that he's in despair. And finally, he jokingly admits to Alyosha that perhaps he wants to be healed by him. So I see this as a big tangled and conflicted mess. I don't know what you guys make of it, but I feel like he contradicted himself about 3 times, but made some really great points. And I think this is really where the rebellion chapter begins. So I'm curious to hear what you guys think. What is his motive behind all this? Is he in despair and hoping Alyosha maybe has a different perspective? Does he not believe in God at all, and this is an intellectual game that helps him outline his philosophy? I don't know. What's your take on this introductory argument? Is all over the place. So I'm curious to hear your take on it.
Perhaps genuine despair. I mean, the chapter ends off with him smiling like a meek little boy. Never before had Alyosha seen him smile that way. So it seems kind of convincing. I'm convinced of his claim that he truly believes and truly desires to be healed, maybe if possible, and that he's in some kind of despair here.
I think he just wants to understand. And he can't. And so when he runs into these walls, this is him bouncing off the walls. as he's trying to understand things, like, and then at the very end he's like smiling like a meek little boy, because that's where he's at. Like, that's where his ultimate vulnerability is. Like, he can't understand this, and like he's turning to Alyosha as like the point at which he might be able to speak some sort of truth into his world. Like, that's what I see.
Let's not forget, this is the same guy that said in the last book, there is no God, there's no afterlife, not even a teensy-weensy bit. And he said, you can even eat each other if there's no God.
Well, I think that's him, like, speaking from his position of strength. Like, here he is, like, getting vulnerable. That's not a position of strength. And here he is meek, right? That's what he understands to be true. That's what he's willing to stake his life on. But he's not going to stake his life when he's meek. Like,
yeah, I think Taggy's completely correct. And I think that he's not only, I don't feel like he's explaining to Alyosha his philosophy as much as he's finally trying to untangle it a little bit. I think some people have difficulty facing themselves in the mirror, or even facing some of their philosophies in the mirror. And I think it's only Alyosha's loving presence that's allowing him to, in some ways, fully encounter some of these questions to their fullest extent. Because he's able to encounter them in a place where it's not as scary, because Alyosha is with him.
Well, and I was just nodding emphatically a lot, because I feel like, to me, I've always said I see a lot of myself in Yvonne, or vice versa, but it's someone to me who's really looking for answers, but nobody's been able to give him a good one yet, right? And as we'll see in the next chapter, I think he raises some questions that if you call yourself a Christian and they don't at least give you pause, you're not hearing what Yvonne is saying. That's what I always said to my students. Like, if you can really hear those stories about the suffering children and not feel a little sick, I don't know how you're a Christian, right? Like, there should be some part of you that has pause. And to me, I see Yvonne as just like, he desperate. Maybe it's just because this is my experience. I feel like so often I've desperately wanted someone to give me a good answer. And then normally you just get the platitudes, or you just get some like, oh, you're an angry person. Like, stop saying that. And to me and Yvonne, I so clearly see someone who most of the time, I think that you're right on when you're saying it's from a place of superiority, but he's developed that as a defense, right? There's this part of him that wants there to be a better answer, but he's not going to be patronized or given a bunch of crap and then told that he's just a stupid, rebellious person. So I see him as genuinely, like, there's this part of him that, maybe because this is me, there's this cynical part that's like, nobody's going to be able to give me a good answer. But then there's this other part that's like, but I sure hope you can. If you could, that would be awesome. I don't know. To me, I get that tension where half of you hopes that someone could give you an answer that puts all your questions to rest. And the other half is like, but so far, mostly y'all just give me a bunch of crap and tell me it's cool and send me on my way. I don't know. As an intellectual wrestling through my Christian heritage and trying to stay a Christian, I feel like I get that tension that, like, is in Yvonne. And that's where I've always had a very generous reading of this character, as he sees a real problem that many people, it's very uncomfortable, I think, if you're a Christian, to actually face what human suffering is. And it's much nicer just to be like, oh, no, you're just an angry, rebellious person. Like, anyway, that's my pro Yvonne tirade.
I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, my whole take on this is basically Yvonne sounds a lot like me whenever I try and wrestle with these questions, and it's kind of the reason I haven't really wrestled with these questions since, like, college. I pretty much just said, I'm an agnostic. I'm not an atheist. I'm not a believer. I don't know. I don't feel like thinking about it because I have to live my life. And that's not always the greatest life. And, I mean, obviously big questions still come up, but I think it's totally possible to be trying to say what you believe or to argue things and to come out with statements that completely contradict each other. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really possible to want to believe, but to be too cynical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with all that. I would also add two things that I thought of. One, this is something that has come up a lot in Brian's and my relationship, and that is the different ways that people organize their thoughts. is that some people like to have everything all thought out before they tell anyone about it. And other people talking about it is the way they kind of sort through things. And Ivan I see as definitely being in the latter category. So things may be coming out as contradictory, but that's because he hasn't sorted it all out yet. He's spouting off all these different ideas that have occurred to him at one time or another and figuring out if it makes any sense. Number two is that he strikes me as a very passionate and emotional person. And sometimes when you feel things very strongly, you say things you feel, and then later on when you're in a cooler temper, you're like, well, I guess that's not entirely right. But at the moment you feel it so strongly that it just comes out as this conviction. And I see him as being very much that sort of person.
God bless you, Emily, for saying those things, which are so startling. I think for those of us who've read the entire book so far about Ivan, but absolutely on point, I think. To suddenly see Ivan as someone who has to work out ideas out loud and contradict himself, he's always been the person that has to present himself as composed. I'm in control. I have these arguments that run circles around other people, don't give away, don't show your hand, kind of. And I think he's doing the exact opposite here. And I think it's kind of great that you came in reading only these chapters and pointing out those points, because Ivan hasn't showed us his whole hand, and here we're getting to see more of it. And I think it's really cool. It's like there's actually a lot more in common between Dmitri and Ivan than we thought. They're thinking out loud. They're full of contradictions. They don't know the whole answer. And I
think, but to build on your point, rage and violence is one way of masking a sense of not knowing, and intellectual superiority is another way, right? We might just see the brothers using different tactics to hide the fact that they're searching for an answer. And one of them was raised in the military and another was sent to school, right? You learn different ways of trying to be the badass in the room. I don't beat people up, but I can pretend to have an intellectually superior argument for days, I'm just saying, I love these connections we're making, and I do think that that's a way that they learn different weapons, and they're both vulnerable around Alyosha and are able to pour out some of their confusion that normally they mask and in their own ways.
But why is it Alyosha?
Well, maybe he's the real deal. Maybe he's the real deal, and people can open up around him.
But why?
Even Fyodor, I don't know why. And
why? Because it is Fyodor, and it is Dmitri, and it is Ivan, and they're all opening up around Alyosha.
To quote Anne Lamott, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure the answer is Jesus. She jokingly says that, and I think it might apply here.
Well, I was just going to say, Alyosha is a Karamazov. He is like them, but he is also the one who has chosen this religious monastic path and chosen to strive to rise above and to see things better, like we were talking about earlier. And maybe the rest of his family, as much as they might make fun of him or other things, admires that and kind of sees that as he's like us, but he's not. He's chosen this completely other way.
Is it the decision or is it something else?
That is the question with Alyosha. Is it by nature? He seems to be a little bit extraordinarily gifted for a weird way that people love him, and he has this gushing honesty and stuff. It seems to come a little too easily, in my opinion. But he is wrestling a little bit. So I don't know if we know the answer to that. And I think it's a great question. Why is Alyosha so...
Well, he too is a Karamazov, right?
But I think the point though is since like this is kind of in honor of Chris Herron, I'm going to quote Chris Herron for a moment.
Yes.
Because he once made a remark about me. He says, "Mike, you've got really good friends," and he said, "And I just realized something about you." And I said, "What is that?" He said, "You're not really good at finding good people. You're just so paranoid. You filter out all the other bastards." And that's what's really going on with Alyosha and the other Karamazovs. Like, they're people who play power games. And whether or not it's because Alyosha's holy or gifted or whatever, he's not into the power game. And in that moment, when they realize he's not playing a game, that's why they start doing something else. Because even if they tried to play a game with him, it doesn't go anywhere. And that's the thing, right? Like when someone, because he's not playing their game, and some people just don't play the game. Like, for example, I know some people with intellectual disabilities who don't play any games just because they're intellectually disabled. They're not capable. But there's just something about certain people, and I'll include myself with this, who don't trust easily. When there's someone in the room who we know is like kind of anti-power, and they just like there's we know when our spidey sense isn't going off. And what is it about Alyosha that makes him that way? I don't know. I think that's a mystery. I think Dostoevsky's trying to keep it complicated. But the point is that they know they can trust him simply because he doesn't trigger their spidey sense.
I would say, I've known people like Alyosha. There's something about them that kind of invites people to open up to them. Sometimes whether they want that or not. And my sense is that one of those things in Alyosha is that he wants to be a person who he's humble enough to be vulnerable to other people. And to a certain extent, vulnerability invites vulnerability. And so I think people feel a little more able to let down their guard around him because he is very earnest and not into playing games. And even though he is, very sweet and serious and all that, he doesn't really see himself as being better than these people.
And with Alyosha, you get the sense immediately somehow he's on your side. Like he's always on your side, no matter how terrible you are. Like he wants good for you. And we've heard from past chapters, he really doesn't judge anybody, and he forgets grievances almost immediately. So it's a very disarming personality,
But how is this shown? I mean, like in the story and like his actions and interactions with people, like I don't know if he's actively involved in like this persona. Like I think it's all passive.
That is the question. Is it by nature or is it by choice? And I
like
don't
it just
know.
shows up, and like people are vulnerable with him. Like he's not like encouraging vulnerability. He's not like.
But to me,
like
that's...
the vulnerability comes in reaction to other people's vulnerability. Like I too am a Karamazov. Like that's not. He doesn't throw that out first and foremost. He throws that out in response and like engages with somebody. It's like a empathetic and retroactive aspect, but it was like in condescension to their vulnerability, perhaps, versus like. Him like saying like, well, I am a Karamazov, so tell me about yourself. Like,
but that's all I'll say is I'll throw my own experiences out there. I'm not saying I'm anywhere nearly as angelic as Alyosha, but I and all of my sisters too have something where people come and tell us their problems. Like to the point where like literally last week in the grocery store, woman came up to me and was like, "Hi, I have not gotten food stamps from the government in weeks, and you look like some like." this has happened to me for years, and to all my sisters. I've had like people come to me and tell me their problems. And I think it has something to do with the fact that I wear my heart on my sleeve. That's what various friends told me in grad school. When I was at the lowest point of my life, when I was not living an angelic monk-like life, when I was drinking like crazy and partying, still, it's like people poured their hearts out to me. So I'm just saying, if it could happen to me, I'm sure it could happen to Alyosha. I do think there is a thing where there's something about me even that I seem to be able to listen to people's problems. And again, I'm not trying to be like, woo, go me. I'm just saying, like, there's something about me and all my family, the way we grew up. People can tell just from looking at us somehow that we will listen to them and care. And I've always said this is like a blessing and a curse, because I get taken advantage of more easily, but also like people tell me their hearts. And the fact that it happens to all my sisters too makes me think it's something about the way we were raised. So I'm just saying, to me, that doesn't seem that unbelievable. Is like, there are certain people or certain traits that it's just like, all like different people all across the spectrum for some reason always wanted to like open up to me. And it's both a blessing and a curse. It's not like I'm some saint. Sometimes I really mess it up when this happens, but like, I don't know what it is. Partly it is just, I think I wear my heart on my sleeve. Like, those of you who know me know there's not a lot of wall with me. Like, you're getting the emotions. But so just to me, that part, I do think that's like an interesting personality thing that like some people just have that.
Alyosha
So anyway,
says Ivan is a mystery, but I think to Ivan, Alyosha is a mystery. Like, how can you be like you are? Why do you have faith? You know, I think that's perhaps part of Ivan's curiosity here is, what is it that you have? Why is this stuff easy for you? And I think Alyosha is maybe a bit of a mystery to us. And I just want to leave it right there. Let's move on from that. And let's talk about, so the brothers have gotten acquainted. It's like, all right, we've got 3 hours. Let's know each other's hearts and discuss the great questions, stay up all night real late, and decide if God exists or not.
Let's have a sleepover.
I was gonna say, it sounds like college to me, right? Friends from college.
Yeah, and Ivan's kind of giddy about this. It's like, this is what Russian boys do, and let's just do it that dumb way for now, like, because it's, you know, that's who we are. So I want to dive in. We've spent an hour and a half, an hour and 45 minutes talking about not the meat of the whole section, which I think is awesome because that's how good Dostoevsky is. It's just crazy. Like, we're not even at the central question. We could talk a lot more about it, but let's dive into Rebellion, because this is the chapter. This is rubber hits the road. Like, this is why Ivan returns his ticket, you know? And I want to start this conversation by pointing out, which I think is fascinating, that as Ivan opens up to his brother and makes his whole case for why he doesn't believe in God, his very first comment on page 236 is that he declares that it is impossible to love one's neighbor, and he can't understand how anyone ever loved anyone, you know, especially if you can see their face. And he explains, Alyosha, I couldn't even talk to you for 3 months because you had this expectant look in your eyes. And I was like, that's needy, and I don't want to be part of it. We've heard Dmitri talk about how Fyodor's face has a certain thing about it that just makes him hate him, you know, like, and I just thought it's really fascinating. This whole chapter about why I'm going to reject God begins with the confession that I have no idea how anyone could say you could ever love your neighbor. And this is an absolute stark contrast to everything we heard Zosima say a few chapters ago about active love. And, you know, if you do actively love your neighbor, your doubt, you know, you'll come to know God and all this stuff. So I think that's, it's just, it's really fascinating that Ivan makes this confession, which is really parallel to what Madame Koklakov confessed to Elder Zosima in A Woman of Little Faith chapter. And then Alyosha immediately grasps his point. He's like, yes, the elders talked about it a lot of times, you know. This has been a theme. But I think it's really interesting. Like, Ivan asserts, love must be a lie of duty. He quotes this like story from a life of a saint, you know, who met this guy who was freezing and like snuggled up with him and breathed in his mouth. And he's like, Ivan's like, that has to be forced duty. Like, he's doing that out of penance or some sort of idea that this is an obligation for salvation. Ivan's opening declaration is basically, love for neighbor is impossible. Did you guys notice that? What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, as soon as he shows his face, love vanishes. What he said about loving another, that resonated with me, having taught for several hours today, where I go in conceptually loving my students and then actually do it and then hate everyone.
I think what's really important, and this ties into what we just said about the mystery of Alyosha and why people trust him. Dostoevsky was obsessed with not just the idea of the icon, but the idea of Christ's gaze. And he writes in a number of his writings about how the most striking thing about Christ was his gaze, and then how he looked at people differently than anyone else had ever looked at them. And that's what's going on with Ivan. That's why he's starting at the moment, the place where he and Alyosha are most divided, which is, I don't know what to make of you, because when you look at me, I feel like you love me, but I don't think that's possible. So therefore, I don't know how you are possible. So this is where we have to begin, because I don't even know how you are possible, because either I'm mistaken, or you are mistaken, or you're an idiot or something. And that's the thing, right? When Taggy asks, sorry, I had to do a bunch of stuff, so I'm a little short of breath, had to run up and down the stairs a few times.
Do some push-ups.
No, I never exercise willingly. So the thing is that you ask, what does Alyosha do? Well, it's not what Alyosha does. It's what Alyosha doesn't do. He has never, ever triggered anybody's trigger warnings, ever. Right? Except the one time with the money, right? With Sniggy, right? Other than that, Alyosha has basically never done that. And that's the thing, right? That's why he begins with this statement, because he's beginning with this foundational point, right? Because they're beginning with the relationship, and that's the reason why Ivan really likes Alyosha. And he can't not like him. He can't, and that's why it's also such a difficult thing for him, because it's the way you look at me, I can't not have affection for you. But that's also kind of messing up my shit. So, so he begins there, because that's their fundamental point of divergence. Is the thing is that Ivan believes Alyosha loves him, and that's why he begins with that. And so when he says, "I believe it is impossible," he's saying it fully aware that he knows that Alyosha believes he loves him, and so he knows how ridiculous it sounds, which is also one of the reasons why he says it with a sense of mirth. Right? Because he understands that he's confronted with some kind of absurdity. Either he's absurd, or Alyosha's absurd, or they're just both absurd.
Can I ask a question to some of the philosophers in the room that we've hopefully drawn in? I just know that multiple times people have said that Dostoevsky is seen as a sort of influential figure in existentialism. And this, to me, seems like one of those points where there could be connections, this sort of connection to that whole idea of hell being other people, or this, you can't actually love other people. I don't know. I'm really interested to hear some of the philosophers say a little bit more about the opening and Ivan's position, and whether it's sort of a reflection of sort of emerging, I know existentialism is much later than this. I'm just saying, is this some sort of him trying to channel European ideas in some way? I just want to get some more philosophy in this discussion.
I would say with the French existentialism, which is the stuff that I really liked later than the Nietzsche, Hell's Other People, all that stuff. Sartre,
isn't that Sartre? Isn't Sartre the one who says Hell's Other People?
Isn't that Nietzsche?
Damn Newton.
No,
nah,
it's Sartre.
Sartre.
It's No Exit.
Sartre?
Yeah, it's the play No Exit by Sartre. Yeah.
He says that love is a choice. It's just that there's no defined, there's no we're not programmed to love. We choose love, and then when we choose love, we choose for everyone. That's my understanding of it. I could.
Well, for Sartre, his basic thing was, when he says hell is other people, His point is that love is a compromise of freedom. And in Alyosha's case, that actually is true. Because when he chooses to love, he puts himself under the people's power.
Oh God, it is. I'm so tired.
And to stick with the French existentialist theme, so Camus was like fascinated with Ivan Karamazov, and he refers to him just like, yeah, he refers to him all over his writings, and he kind of takes this chapter and the next one as like a starting point. He talks about, Ivan's kind of everything is permitted as like, that's where you have to start, because you can't, once you've gone through the portal that Ivan has opened, you can't go back. So you have to go forward, and you have to exist in this world where you can no longer have hope that some sort of end state of affairs will justify everything that came before and make it right. So his question is, how do you situate yourself relative to that fact? And I think he has a lot of respect for Ivan's answer, which I think he is giving here, which is so Ivan says, like, I return the ticket, and Camus has a lot of respect for that answer of basically, you acknowledge the way that the world is, which is kind of absurd, and you say that, like, my stance in relation to that is going to be revolt. My stance in relation to that is going to be rebellion. That I refuse that, and for Camus, that entails trying to create values in a world that doesn't have them, which is, I think, a stage that Ivan doesn't really get to. Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah.
I really appreciate that look forwards towards how future philosophers are using this work to influence their ideas, and how it's already started a conversation. I think Dostoevsky's way ahead of his time here, and perceiving kind of like the rabbit hole in a sense.
I don't know. I don't know if that's actually true. I don't know if like modern philosophy is any better than ancient philosophy, perhaps, in terms of like gripping with existential crises that exist for all humanity. Like, is he really ahead of his time, or is he just like part of humanity? Might be a more apt question to ask versus, I don't know. This whole like
I
modern.
think that question a lot too. I don't think they're exclusive, because I do think he anticipated certain strains of thought that became emphasized later in other movements. But is it just about the human experience? That's a very valid point.
I think the idea that like consciousness itself and thinking itself is kind of a burden and something that is a problem that you have to grapple with and like deal with in one way or another. You transcend the problem, or you figure it out, or you ignore it, but that it's like there. That was a pretty new idea, and Dostoevsky is one of the very first people who makes that really explicit. In Notes from Underground, he says something like thinking is a disease, or thinking too much is a disease, something like that. And that's a pretty new idea in the late 19th century, even if, or at least to be expressed in that way.
Not having an answer was a really different, radical thing, right? Not having a nature of what man is, and not having answer to these questions. That was definitely, could be radical and revolutionary. I agree with that.
What is not new, to Michael's point, is trying to figure out why stuff sucks on Earth.
Yep.
True.
And I want to open the floodgates to this chapter.
We go
talked about
in.
specialized topics and minor things. It's rebellion, folks. Let's go.
And we've already been on for 2 hours, so let's
Yeah. It's time to go all in here. Dive in the deep end. Basically, Ivan is saying, grant a harmonious, perfect ending at the end of time, which is not even necessarily what Christianity professes.
Yep.
Let's get the best possible outcome. And I still think that's garbage if there are tiers of these abused children in the process. And I return my ticket. I reject this world. I don't reject God or reject this world. He confesses this is his creed that he lives by. I wonder what it means to live by that creed is one of my questions. But floodgates are open, so speak.
And partly it's sad. He says he can't live by it. He says you can't live by rebellion. And so he's hoping, we've talked about the fact that at least part of Ivan is hoping that there will be an answer to these questions.
I think Ivan is conflicted in every sense of the word here. Like, he wants to see like a resolution, but he really can't see it happening. And like, even if it does have a resolution, like, he's got all these other issues. Like, is the resolution actually worth the effort? And that whole entire thing, like, if the resolution is bought by tears of children, innocent children, like, is it actually a good resolution? And like, these are really open-ended questions. And like, I don't know, it's like, dare I say, it's like, is it better to say like this is not actually worth discussing relative to Alyosha's response to it?
Jason had brought up Camus, I think. Reading this was like reading, like, oh, I see where you came from. Like, it was just so. I'm wrestling with all these questions. Everything is absurd, and somehow I have to rest in this cradle of not being able to stop asking, while also not knowing.
And I think, like, when we say Alyosha's response, I think a really important sort of throwaway line is when Ivan is saying to Alyosha, oh, I'm sorry I'm making you suffer. And Alyosha's, no, I want to suffer too. Like, that to me is a moment where I see that I am both of those characters. If you're someone that's Alyosha, if you're so empathetic and compassionate that everyone reaches out to you, how do you do these questions? I think to me, that was when the first time I read this book, it was like, oh, thank God. Like, I feel like these are the questions that, to me, this was what college was about. Suddenly realizing the full extent of how awful the world was. And nobody wanted to give you any, like, everyone just wanted to be like, no, it's fine. It's going to be cool. And you're like, but is it cool? And they're like, yeah, dude, I've got like a 5-part philosophy for you that's going to fix this. And to me, part of Ivan's rebellion is just saying, like, is there anything that could ever make this okay? Like, and I think that the fact that Alyosha co-signs, that he says, I want to suffer too, is this moment that, like, to me, when I talk with students about that quote, that this is both the greatest argument for faith and against faith, I don't see those as separate. It's like, if you're going to make an argument for faith, it better look at this. Because my students are always asking me, why do you like so many novels that have horrible things in them? That's a question I've literally been asked by students. Because I do. I love horrible. But because to me, that was the question at the root of my whole college experience and my whole journey of faith is, if you can't make sense of the worst things that are happening to people, that's not real faith, right? That's some sort of lie you've come up with. And that's where I feel like existentialism and Christianity are both trying to offer an answer to that. Like, how do you deal not just with the burden of choice or free thought, but with the burden of knowing these things happen in the world? And yeah, that's, I'll stop now.
Wasn't that the central crisis here? Isn't it almost like Ivan is the existentialist and Alyosha is like the Christian, and like they're kind of coming to the same sort of thing? Like, we're actually acknowledging that these things exist, and like I reject it in one way, and like Alyosha's like, you know what, actually I almost I'm
But
just going to co-sign on this.
But the key though is because you got to remember that when Alyosha, because that central quote is when Alyosha says, "I would suffer also," because that's the difference between Ivan and Alyosha. Is Alyosha, because he has this groundedness in his faith, suffering does not damage his sense of trust all the way down fundamentally. And that's the thing, because he wants to choose to participate in it. And the nature of when Ivan says, I can't handle a kid suffering, I can't handle the torture of the child. Well, what he's talking about is scandal, right? And he's also talking about himself. Because the whole passage about it's better that a guy have a millstone tied around his neck, that whole thing, that Greek word scandalon, the reference is that it's not just that you hurt the child, it's that you damage that child's ability to trust.
Right.
You damage that child's ability to have a relationship. And that's exactly where Ivan is. That's the thing. But for some reason, Alyosha, in spite of also being a largely abandoned orphan child, is the only one out of the brothers Karamazov, including Smerdyakov, who may or may not be the bastard child, who for some reason doesn't have orphan thinking. For some reason, he still has this capacity of childlike trust, and that's the weird thing. So it's not that they both don't suffer, and it's not that they both don't see the same thing. It's just somehow, some way, Alyosha is still looking at it from a perspective of innocence, but not naivete. Innocence in the literal meaning, he's still radically open to it.
That wasn't my reading. My reading was that Alyosha was Ivan was saying, I'm sorry, I'm upsetting you with these stories. And Alyosha was like, no, bring it on. If I'm really a Christian, I should be able to hear these and be miserable too. He wants to be made miserable by hearing how bad things are.
I don't know if
at this moment, I don't see Alyosha as naive or hiding or pushing it away. I feel like he's really saying, yes, Ivan, tell me how miserable it's going to get.
No, that's what I mean. He's
okay.
He's innocent without being naive. He's radically open. People often think innocence means I've never been stained. I've never been touched.
I'm saying in these next two chapters, I think we're going to see Alyosha waver a bit. I think he's a bit uncomfortable. I think there are times the stories really upset him. Because remember, we've heard in the past section that Alyosha loves children. So what more miserable way to get at Alyosha, the one who will let a child bite his finger to the bone and then be like, it's cool, and right, than to talk about torturing children. So I feel like Alyosha is inviting a sort of question that goes to the root of his faith and is going to challenge it.
Well, is Ivan just biting his finger to the bone here?
Yeah, I think he is. But I think, okay, we're getting into, I'm just saying, any of us who are Christians, if it doesn't bother us that children are getting tortured to the point that it makes us sick, I don't think we're really Christians. And I think that's part of what Alyosha is saying is yeah, if I'm really a Christian, I should be able to hear this, and it might make me sick, but bring it. Emily, you're going to say something.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
I would say one thing I saw Alyosha, he's really struggling with this. It really bothers him, and he's struggling with how to fit it all together and what it all means. And I think one of the differences between Alyosha and Ivan comes when I think Ivan sees suffering as something that's either inflicted by God or that God allows to happen. And Alyosha even brings up at one point that God suffers with us, that Christ entered into our suffering in his sacrifice and his crucifixion. And I think Alyosha sees that as redemptive, that God is suffering about this just as much as we are. But he's still struggling with that idea all the same.
I agree completely, and I think this is the brilliance of Ivan's argument and why I'm highly sympathetic to him, Satanists, and atheists. Because, and even Ivan at the end of the chapter is like, I'm surprised you didn't march out your savior sooner.
Yep.
With your type, it usually comes up right away. But I think the brilliance here is Ivan is not only raising the question of why is there evil, but what is it in our nature that makes this so easy? He says on page 237, there's a lot of people who don't know and can't understand love. And he says, is this because of their bad qualities, or is it inherent in their nature? Can we blame the creator for the way we are, or is it our own responsibility? The whole deck seems rigged, I think, to Ivan. Like, people are put on this earth in a impossible scenario. They're fools, they're idiots. They've been raised by abusive fathers. Take the case of the kid presented to the shepherds in France at age 6. Like, the guy grows up to be a murderer and a thief. But, like, it's really not his fault at all. And I don't even think he casts blame on the people that received him. Like, I think one of the big questions Ivan is asking is, in this created order, are we not all in a stuck position where it's impossible to love? It's easy to do damage, and we're all going to hurt each other. And maybe things get worked out in the end, but this whole shitty creation in the midsection is not worth whatever may come out of it. This is just, I'm returning my ticket. I want no part in this. He's a bit of a satanic hero here, the right side to be on against a God who would allow all this middle passage of bullshit is not the team you want to be on.
I think Ivan is asking for a justice. He's asking for a worldly justice, I think. He wants things to fit into his realm of what he considers to be right, and what he considers to be like true, and what he considers to be generous and loving. But then we also go back into the whole counterpoint earlier of like, well, what does it mean to be like free thinking, and what does it mean to have like actual free choice and freedom? And I think this is all like kind of pointed here, side by side. Like, well, what happens when freedom actually creates injustice?
I think Ivan would
I
ask
also
if
think
people
it's
were ever actually free. Like, were they not rigged with the whole game against them from the beginning?
I think it's important to know a huge part of Ivan's argument isn't just like we need justice in this time, because he is saying, let's say, like he talks about like, let's say I see the lamb, except he replaced like it's some, but he's basically, let's say I see them lay down, let's say I see everyone embrace, still can't make up for how terrible it was to death in this reality. So he really does have a vision that seems to expand to eternity, but is saying, I just can't. And that's where I think this whole idea of the Euclidean mind is important, right? He's like saying, given my, he's like, I get it. I have an earthly mind. I can't get it. But it's making like, I have some notion of justice. And within that, there's nothing anyone can do that would make sense of a tortured, murdered child. Like, I think that's pretty, to me, an important argument. Like, his whole case to Alyosha is like, would you, God, who from the outset said, look, I'm going to make sense of this all someday, you'll get it someday, but you have to watch a child now. And Alyosha's like, no, I wouldn't accept that. Like, it seems there is some level he's really challenging us to acknowledge questions that I think are really fundamental to any religious faith, is like, whatever reality is coming someday, really horrible things happen right now, like abjectly horrible things that if you let them in will make you feel sick. And if you haven't felt any moment of discomfort about that, have you really felt the pain and suffering these people are? That's where I've wondered if there's some existential part, logical. It's putting us beyond a logical system to, like, in lived reality, could you look at a child being tortured and come back to me with any of these arguments? Like, there's some element of that seems really important to him. Like, don't give me your huge theologies. Look at that child and tell me this makes sense. Sorry, I'm very like pro Ivan. I just like, because like I said, I'm gonna go on and say I think Dostoevsky gives a resounding argument against. I really think in this case he's in Ivan's side. He's like, understand the full weight of this argument. Don't dismiss it or move too quickly to an answer. Like, really think about how bad this is.
Well, I don't know if I agree with that. Like, I think Alyosha is kind of like where Dostoevsky is in this. I think Alyosha is where you need to be. Like, it's not about dismissing things, and it's not about easy answers. It's about being. It's about suffering with these people. It's not about like having the answer.
I'd just like to chime in with a moment from the text here to ground everybody. I do think Alyosha is taken off guard by this. You know, I don't think he has things figured out. I don't think he knows the answers. And I think he's deeply troubled by it. Maybe even is having his faith shaken here. He says to his brother, "Why are you tormenting me?" Yeah, he did say I want to suffer earlier, but it's kind of like, whoa, crap, where'd this stuff come from? I guess if this is the way things are, I need to know. But he also says, why are you tormenting me? You know, like, this is not, I don't think he has an answer, personally.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't have an answer. But that's what Ivan wants from him. Ivan wants an answer. Alyosha can't provide one.
I don't know that he's saying he wants an answer. I think he's, you know, somebody brought up the revolt earlier. That's what that is knowing that there is not an answer and still finding a way to carry on.
But is that actually a revolt? I think that's Alyosha's revolt, perhaps. But I don't think that's Ivan's revolt.
I think, to me, the way I read it is, so often when I've gone to church leaders, they do see this as rebellion. If you can't just if you can't accept the happy ending, it's just because you're rebellious or you're proud or you're angry. And the reason I find Dostoevsky to be so brilliant is he gives this position its due. And he's going to give us a counterpoint later. But he's going to say, these really are questions that should shake you to your core. Like, it's not just that you're some angry, stupid atheist that's been ruined by European philosophy. Like, get on board with the Orthodox Russian train. He's going to say, like, and I think Alyosha is the viewpoint where we see, if you're someone who truly is compassionate and kind and caring and merciful and all the things that Orthodoxy is teaching you to be, this should at least give you pause. And that's part of the reason I fell in love with this book, is that he's able to fully embrace Alyosha's point of view and fully embrace Ivan's. And later he's going to give us other people who have these perspectives. But I feel like he goes all in and is just like, and it's funny because Ivan keeps saying, I'm going to circumscribe my case and just talk about children. But there's also that flip side of, like, if you have any bit of human compassion in you, this should shake you, right? Like, torturing children is really nauseating. And if, like, it's really trying to draw us out and get us, I think, on that side for at least a moment to see why people would be so angry about this and why Ivan might want an answer.
Not even that. It goes even further. And I don't think any of you are taking this seriously enough so far in this conversation, except maybe Melissa. But Ivan has gone so far as to say, not only is this crappy the way things are, he's going to say human nature is making you do this. He's going to say there's a pleasure you take in tormenting children, and it's in all of us. Did you notice that moment? He said, because of their innocence, we want to torture them. It gives us some joy. Like, humans are really, really fucked up. Like, that's, you know, and another very important point is, you know, what can make up for this? Can a final harmony make up for this? Can a punishment to the tormentors make up for this? Ivan's saying nothing makes up for this. You know, if this exists, if this is necessary for the final harmony, I don't want any part of this. I'm returning my ticket. I think there may be a possible error that I could critique in his argument, but I don't think we've taken his argument seriously enough yet for me to critique it. You know, it's like maybe Ivan has made up his mind to rebel, but I don't know. I feel like we really need to hear this argument out. Where is the harmony if there's hell? You know, it's again, Ivan is so full of contradictions. He opens this whole thing by saying, I don't believe love for the neighbor is possible. And then he spends a whole chapter talking about how crushed his heart is on behalf of children, you know, suffering. That's a contradiction. Can you only love them in theory? What if it's personal? Like he says, I'm going to return the ticket. What does that even mean? Like, how do you live in rebellion? You know, what is his rebellion going to be? I'm really curious. If you're angry at God and you think the whole world is terrible and full of suffering and unjust, what do? You know, what we've heard him say before is eat your neighbor, go ahead and kill your dad. Is this the response to a shitty world, is just do whatever you want and raise Cain? You know, that I haven't, it's like he wants to love people, but he's declared it's impossible. So isn't this the world he gets? What right does he have to reject it? It seems like he's embracing the very essence of its logic, isn't he? Is he not?
But why shouldn't you? If at the end of the day, no matter what you do, children are going to get tortured. And I'm not saying this as what I truly believe. I'm just saying, like, I think that's part of the logic, and that's how we get Nietzsche, right? Is like, why not just will to power? Why not just take control of everything? If at the end of the day, like. And I'm saying this because I think Dostoevsky is so brilliant that he really captures why you would have that argument. And I think Ivan is right. If there isn't anything that can make sense of this all, if there's no final reckoning that can somehow make sense of this all, why not be Trump and have 27 yachts and become president and do whatever you want? Like, does it matter at the end of the day? And I feel like that's a question so few Christians really take seriously, is like, either, and this is one of the things that to me has been revelatory and weirdly enough has made me want to be more of a Christian. It's like, either none of this makes any sense at all and we should all just like get a million yachts and all the champagne and do drugs and just do whatever we want with our life, or it all makes total sense, right? It's not like, I feel like so much of American Christianity is very middle of the road, like, just in case I'm going to be good, so maybe I can get into heaven. And this vision is really like, either this is all going to make sense, or y'all should just go out and lizard eat lizard and do what you're going to do. And that actually makes a weird kind of sense to me.
The other revolt could, depending on who you read, revolt could be kill yourself.
Well, I think
revolt could be, acknowledge that things are indifferent or meaningless or worse, and then choose to soldier on and carry on in the best possible way, despite how absurd of a situation you're stuck in.
I think Melissa's got something, like when she talks about the middle of the road Christianity and not confronting it, that was Dostoevsky's frustration. Like when he heard Pascal's wager, supposedly Dostoevsky vomited. No, I'm serious. Like, I did not say that as a joke, because he when he heard it, he heard in that, like, the death knell. He heard Nietzsche's God is dead in that statement, because he saw that in that, right, like it allows people to do that very middle of the road thing. It's why he's ranting against the Jesuits in this section. It's because he says that kind of rationalist approach is precisely where it's, I know Chris thinks we're not taking, as someone who was educated by some rationalist Jesuits, I understand maybe why you don't think I'm taking it seriously, but I think I am. And I think the big thing is that the frustration that you can hear, I don't know. I mean, I know we really want to get into the heart of this question, but can we even talk about this question without talking about the next section? Because I'm not even sure we can even talk about rebellion without talking about the poem. I mean, I really don't. I just don't. I know, and I'm not saying we should. I'm just saying, like, I don't think you can really do it. I don't think you can really talk about it without it.
Well, as somebody who has not yet read the next chapter,
Right.
Through all of this, and there's so many different little pieces I could have, but one thing that really, really jumped out at me in this chapter is the bottom of 244, top of 245. When he's talking about a potential happy ending, I guess, the grand, where everyone says, "Just art thou, O Lord." You see, Alyosha, it may well be that if I live until that moment or rise again in order to see it, I myself will perhaps cry out with all the rest, looking at the mother embracing her child's tormentor, "Just art thou, O Lord." But I do not want to cry out with them. And what really, really struck me in this is that he's saying, maybe if I did live to see heaven is kind of contradictory, but live to see the judgment day or the whatever's supposed to make it all better, then maybe I would say, okay, it was all worth it, but I don't want to say it was all worth it. I don't want it to be okay. And I'm not 100% sure, we keep talking about return the ticket, and what does that mean? Does that mean I don't want heaven because that might make me think that torturing children is okay? Does it mean, I don't know. Sorry, I had like 3 other things and now they're all gone out of my head. But the conflict.
I'm nodding a great point, so don't be sorry.
Really strikes me.
I think Ivan's stuck. I mean, he's really stuck here. Like he wants to see like all this thing happen, and like at the same time he doesn't. Like it's like this whole huge conflict for him. Like yes, I would love to see it in harmony, but at the same time, like no, it doesn't make it all right. Like there's no way. Like tormenting children and suffering is not good, and it's terrible, and that's not the way it's supposed to be. And
yeah, and somebody said a little bit ago, whether he's asking for answers, does he want answers? And I think he's almost saying that no answer would be good enough. Like he just can't comprehend that there even is an answer.
Well, I almost think he says like to every answer that potentially is there, like he gives a counterpoint that says like, no, this answer's not good enough. Like, oh, it'll be fine in the end. Like, no, that answer's not good enough. Or, suffering is a good thing in itself. It's like, no, that's not good enough. Like, every single point that comes across that could be a potential answer, he's like, that's not good enough. Like.
But I think
Absolutely.
there is some value in what he's saying. And I'm thinking about this after like a book that really affected me this year is reading, I can't remember her last name right now, but there's this amazing book that's called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I Loved. And this woman who is a theology professor at Duke is talking about how, yes, she is a theology professor and she ends up getting diagnosed with terminal cancer. And her suffering is transformed. But there's something about somebody else telling that to you that is not the same, right? Like everyone can go through that experience and learn to find meaning in their own suffering, which I feel like is especially poignant in the group that we have here. But she was saying when other Christians came to me and said, oh, it's fine. God has a plan for you. There's a meaning here, that's like the most soul-crushing, horrible, awful thing ever. And that's not God. That simultaneously her experience was seeing the grace of God in her experience and seeing how evil and even satanic it can be when other people try to shortcut your suffering by telling you that. And I do feel like Yvonne is onto something when he's saying, and I don't have the page, but he's saying like, look, if the mother embraces the murderer for her own suffering, that's fine. But does she have any right ever to embrace for her own child being ripped apart by dogs? Like to me, that is where that is. And again, where I'm saying, I don't fully buy Yvonne's argument. I do think that there's a whole Christian idea of the redemptive nature of suffering that is important, but that he's making a good point when he's saying, when we come in and tell other people like, oh, it's fine, like Jesus died on the cross, so everything is cool, like let your kid be ripped apart by dogs, and like why are you even having a question? There's something actually evil about that it's not fully grasping the dichotomy of suffering, which is on the one hand, this is abject and miserable and terrible, and we should rage and suffer. And I think he doesn't see the redemptive part that an Orthodox Christian would see in that. But
Right.
as someone coming out of Protestant Christianity, I'm just saying I grew up in a culture that wanted to shortcut the whole miserable part, right? That's just like, no, let's get to the resurrection, dudes. And I feel like Yvonne has this real point where he's saying, could we for at least a minute admit that it's like terrible that kids get ripped apart by dogs? Like for a moment before we get to the hope, can we say that sucks?
I'd like to speak on behalf of Orthodox Christianity and say there is no fucking redemptive point to suffering of children or anyone. There's no redemptive point. That, to me, is actually the flaw in Yvonne's case here, is that he assumes that this higher harmony is built upon the suffering, needs the suffering, desires the suffering, and makes it better in the end.
And that's
Suffering
why
is bullshit.
Dostoevsky.
We created that. We created this part. This is our part. This is our part. This is bullshit. This is not God. You know, I think Yvonne has he doesn't say it directly, but to me, the even deeper argument behind Yvonne's rebellion here is not just like, you know, shall I return the ticket because the world is full of suffering and it's God's fault, but
okay. I think we need to talk about. I think, sorry, but I think we need to talk about like coming from the Orthodox perspective. I think we need to delve a little bit deeper into the whole like Russian mentality about suffering, because I think that's a huge part of it that no one else understands except maybe the twixt of us, maybe the third or fourth. But like suffering is redemptive, and like we need to suffer, and we need to make this painful and terrible, and by the terrible, and like this is also axe I have to grind, but like it's through that we achieve salvation or something like that. But it's like this fallacy, and I think Dostoevsky is railing against that in this, and a whole bunch of other stuff too. But yeah.
I'd like to quote Chris Heron, if I may. He gave this talk on the Paschal Mystery once at ICC, and he was pointing at the different Christians. He's like, you know, there's some people when they think about Christianity and the death and resurrection of Christ, some people are Good Friday people. And he points at me in the audience because I'm a Catholic. And then he says, and some people are Easter Sunday people. They're super joyful. And then he points at Ryan Phillips, our Protestant friend in the audience. And he says, but you don't meet too many people who are Holy Saturday people. And then he says, I'm a Holy Saturday person. I'm a tomb dweller. And when he said that, I couldn't believe in the moment how brilliant it was. My mind was blown. And like what Heron's point was when he said that is like one can become there is, as Melissa just said, you can't shortcut it, right? And I think that's the thing, is that when someone's in pain, like isn't the human need, desire to like go straight to the end of the pain, right? And yet within that kind of Paschal thing that Dostoevsky's getting at, there's that necessary intermediate step. And I think that like that's what's so hard about this chapter, is it's this necessary intermediate step that's just very uncomfortable, because you literally have to come to grips with the idea that death is real and it has consequences, and it's not just death and resurrection good, but like that actually there's this period in the liturgy where we have to like spend a day contemplating the death of God and live with the death of God for a whole day.
I guess my question to everyone would be, we've talked a lot about what Yvonne, what Alyosha, and so fourth, third person parties think about things, but what would you say to Yvonne, or are you in complete agreement? Because I personally think his argument is a slam dunk.
McGee, I wanted to hear more about what you were going to say about how suffering is not entirely necessary and it's just bullcrap. Like, I felt like that was an important point.
Well, it is, but not until you've taken suffering seriously.
Well, yeah, I know that. I just was basically saying same.
I still don't think anyone's taken Yvonne's argument seriously enough. I really don't. I think it's a slam dunk. If this guy says to you...
You don't think I've taken it seriously?
Well, you have. Maybe. Maybe I have.
All right, Mitchie.
I don't know if I have.
Go ahead and talk.
So there are, if we have these three stories of children and, everything's made well in the end, but isn't it nobler if I'm like, this whole order is bullshit, like, I'm not on your team, I can't believe in you, even if you exist. I don't want to be any part of your paradise that, drags dog torn apart children into it, and then they're all happy. Does anyone have any response to Yvonne? I think Alyosha's response sucks, personally. There is one who can forgive on behalf of all because he was innocent, and that's Jesus Christ, who died and entered into the suffering. So what? So another person suffered. What does that do to take away the suffering of everyone else? What about all these children who were 8 years old, 6 years old, tormented by their parents? Like, how do you let this happen? How do you not intervene? Like, this order is pathetic. Any average, crappy, sinful adult can imagine a better order than this. So, why would I want to be a part of the divine reconciliation of all things at the end of time when this whole order it's like polluted, I'm sorry, guys. I just think Yvonne has an incredible point here that no one is taking seriously enough. And I would be curious to see, does anyone have a response to him, or are you just all in complete agreement? You're so in agreement that it's like, all right, that's it.
What do you mean not serious enough? That's what...
Exactly. I don't know what makes you think we're not taking it seriously. I mean, I pretty much said at the beginning that Yvonne sounds like me, and I haven't said a whole lot because mostly it would just start me ranting about how much I hate the world and how many years I've been depressed and how especially since the last presidential election, I've just every single day spent angry at everything, and I kind of didn't want to just go on that for 2 hours.
I'm sorry. My quarrel is with Michael Taggy specifically.
It always is.
Let me clarify. But it's like, I think we're not discussing the heart. Is like, is this a good argument? And is there anyone who doesn't agree? Why?
Well, of course it's a good argument, but it's a Euclidean argument, is it not? I mean, like that's the thing. Like I think if you want us to give an answer to it, you're asking us to transcend the limits of human reason. I don't think I'm utterly powerless in front of it, and I don't know what you expect me to say before something because 2 + 2 will never equal 5 in regular math.
I think it's just what I'm always, when I push on this argument with students, and I feel like this is partly what McGee rhetorically is doing right now, is acknowledge the power of this argument, right? Like, because to me, when my students ask, why do you like dark, horrible text, is a real Christian argument, if it's really going to be redemptive, should be able to stand up to how dark this argument is. Right
well, I think
now.
that, like, the difficulty of this question is that it doesn't, it's not able to give a satisfactory answer.
But I think that's where I
dwell with.
Was asking if there's an existential component, is like, maybe we don't have a logical rhetorical answer, but can we at least all as a group admit there's something sickening about this question, right?
Of course.
If we would talk mathematically, there's it would require that God has given us a discount rate for like sustained utility in the everlasting metaphysical sense. that would mean that God's a sadist, or and God needs us to make trade-offs. And I mean that is true about this existence. There's scarcity, and we're forced to make trade-offs about everything. And that would mean that there's some cosmic trade-off you have to make, where I trade off misery and suffering now, and if you want it to make sense in the mathematical sense, like $1 today is more valuable than $1 tomorrow.
Well, I think that's the whole point of like Ivan, and the whole point of this argument, and McGarvey's point here is like we want to like kind of put into like mathematical terms like the value of suffering, and like suffering equals redemption, and like so if you put 5 units of suffering into your life equation, like you equal like eternal salvation or something like that, which is bullshit. That's nonsense. Like that's not what we're supposed to do. And like if that's your whole worldview, like that's insanity, and I don't want any part of that either. Like
But I don't think it's been difficult, because I mean I'm a humanist, right? And so one of the things we talk about is an affective story. There's one story of a murdered child that's different than knowing the data on murdered children. And I think part of Yvonne's story is, do you know any like a child that was killed in a stupid car accident? And it was gut-wrenching. Like, can anyone, the emotional experience of that gut-wrenchingness, and not for a minute at least quibble with the theology that makes it seem simple?
Well, yeah,
and again, I'm not saying that because I think the long game of this novel is to say there is a totally paradoxical answer that makes sense of all of this. But I feel like one of the brilliant things Dostoevsky does is say, like, that shouldn't be quick for any of you. You should at least sit in this misery for a little bit. Like Alyosha. And that's where I feel like, I think you're right, Taggy, that Alyosha is the sort of voice that gives us a way through. But the fact that he's really tortured and miserable for a while, I think is important. That it's like, we should all be a little miserable thinking about the fact that, like, in this world, children get ripped apart by dogs and like get shot in the face by soldiers, and that happens.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, as you said, like Alyosha just kind of sits here quietly, and isn't that what each of us can do? I mean, like that's really the reality. And like, is it really an answer that we can proffer forth? Like, yeah, like God's good, and like all the suffering is great, and like that's crappy answer. That's crappy answer to your friend who's sitting there with cancer, or this child who's sick, and it's all God's will. Like, that's bullshit. It's not God's will. Like, that's.
So then why does it happen? I mean, that's the whole point.
Well,
God can be with you in your suffering, but why do we have to suffer?
Yeah, that's the question is.
Right, that's the whole point of this chapter, is like, we're not supposed to have an easy, satisfactory, comfy, feel-good answer to this question. Like, shitty things happen, and they always happen, and it's still shit. It's not good. And that's where we have to sit.
We're starting to play on the same team a little bit. I would like to invite David Jorgensen to offer any thoughts about anything whatsoever in our reading.
Jorgensen.
You don't
We
have
need
to
the
answer
squirrel.
this question. I'd simply like to hear your voice about anything you choose.
What I've been struggling with or wrestling with this whole discussion is when the brothers get acquainted, when they're talking, Ivan says, "I love life," and Alyosha says, you should life above everything else in the world, even above logic, love life. And this contrast between life and logic, I think, then turns into this religious discussion, and it's not clear to me if religion or God is to either of them put in the bucket of life or in the bucket of logic. And this whole conversation of the rebellion is kind of that trying to figure out where to put God. If you put God in logic, then you come up with this contradiction. It's just impossible to believe in a God that would exist in a world that exists like this. It's just a contradiction. There's no logic to it. And yet somehow, like, the idea of a God is so compelling that that like we're talking about it. If there wasn't some like compelling reason to talk about God, then you would just live your life. You just go on. You wouldn't even think about God. Like, if it just was completely illogical, then why are you even talking about it? So it seems like there's some really compelling reason that, like, God seems like life to these two people, that, you know, no matter what you do, you're stuck with God. As much as Ivan hates the world, he still says that, like, he has to accept God. And that's, I don't know, it's kind of a weird circular argument. There's no good conclusion one way or the other, at least in these chapters, on how that pans out. But that back and forth, that contrast, and that almost like flip-flopping of where God fits in the whole scheme of life versus rationality was kind of a fascinating piece of this discussion.
McG, can I ask a question?
Yes.
No.
Well, thanks,
Thank you,
Taggy. I appreciate that. Okay. I know that this is a huge theological, philosophical question, but maybe this is just me because I have a very particular literary whatever, but don't you think this is not as much about God all the time as much as this is about a father-son thing? I know we're talking about how could God allow this, but to me, I feel like the differing perspectives is very simple. I feel like Ivan had a crappy dad. And I know that you can't oversimplify it to that, but he was abandoned by his own father. That's his experience. And then you have Alyosha, who has the experience of a loving father in the elder. And I feel like you can't have this discussion without really that being the kind of the carnal, real flesh and blood interlocuting thing that's driving this.
I guess I just have a problem with that because I had a loving, very present father, and I still am with Yvonne 100% of the way on his argument about how maybe God, like, I mean, just saying my dad was never like, cool, let's let people get tortured. And yet I still see that kids get tortured in this world.
Well,
I have an awesome family. It's the rest of the world I can't stand, so.
Well, I'm just saying, I don't think it can be completely separated from that, because I feel like, in the sense of, like, you have someone who is going to relate to God. There's going to be a fun, like, whether or not someone is able to be in a trusting relationship, I feel like that's really fundamentally present. I feel like that's a fundamentally, like, and the fact that one of them is severely scandalized and the other one is not severely scandalized, I feel like that gets to the core of the issues of what's going on. And I'm not saying that you can't have a great father and be on Team Yvonne, or you can't have a father who abandoned you and be on Team Alyosha. Like,
Well, I don't think I'm totally on board with you. I'm totally on board with you. And I think like if I would want to clarify one thing, it'd be like nobody's on Team Yvonne 100% here. I think I don't think I don't think anyone's completely signed off on that. I think there's like some hesitation. I think Team Yvonne here is like 100%, and like people here are not quite 100% if they're on Team Yvonne.
Speak for yourself, Michael. You can only speak for yourself. Don't speak for other people.
You're 100% on Team Yvonne? I don't know. But I think like the experience that we're talking about is like the experience of love. And I think Micah would probably say that that's probably the case. Like Alyosha found love in the altar, and Yvonne has never had that. And like it's that experience that taints the worldview of Alyosha versus Yvonne.
This is partly, though, why I think McGee was arguing that some people aren't taking Yvonne's argument seriously, is we're looking for escapes out of it. We're looking for ways we can blame his psychology or we can blame his upbringing, as opposed to, like, just look in the face of a murdered child and don't give me some psychology about some father. Like, tell me children get murdered and you don't have a problem with that. And I know I'm being really aggressive right now. I'm just saying, like, I'm not 100% Team Yvonne. I'm just saying, no, I don't think that this is Yvonne's, like, daddy issues. I think this is, for me, one of the huge things that almost drove me away from Christianity, and that I still wrestle with on a regular basis, is that very pious people get uncomfortable when I come and say, explain to me why the world sucks so badly. And that's all. And that's where I honestly think, like, this whole idea of, like, the true Russian, I think Yvonne is in some ways the true Russian. He wants to believe. He wants to believe there's people out there that can move a mountain with their prayers. But he can't because he sees children getting shot in the face by armies. And that's me. Like, that's where I'm like, maybe I'm not 100% Yvonne, but maybe I am, because I think Yvonne wants to believe and is like, well, please, somebody make sense of the babies getting shot in the face for me. And don't tell me it's just because, like, my dad sucks. Like,
but
I'm being really polemic right now, but I'm just saying,
sure,
I'm with McGee. Let's take this argument seriously. Let's really, like, even if Yvonne has psychological issues, to me, that's where philosophically abstracted, the fact remains. Children get murdered in just horribly, abjectly terrible ways on a regular basis. And for me, theology doesn't eventually make sense of that. And I am someone who's still a Christian. And at the end of the day, I think when we get to some of the other arguments here, I believe these things will be redeemed. But I think Yvonne's argument logically makes the most sense. And if you believe in a purely logical world, we should all just, like, go eat lizards. Lizard eat lizard, because everything seems to suck.
All right. Yeah. I'd like to, I do think Micah has a point here, that Alyosha has some kind of weird hope because he's experienced an act of love that Yvonne hasn't, which maybe allows him to suspend and defy reason. I don't think he's negating Yvonne's argument. There might be a really good point to that.
I don't think I...
But Michael, hold on.
Okay.
Everything isn't about rebutting you. I also just want to, like, really throw in a weird warp to this whole thing, which is like, what if Yvonne never believed in God, like he stated at the beginning? Man made God up. What is the whole point of this argument, you know? Oh. And that Shyamalan twist.
What if Yvonne doesn't even believe what he's saying right now? Oh, God. Now we're in triple jeopardy here.
Well, I think that was better than most Shyamalan twists.
Yvonne has stated consistently that he can't believe in God. Is this why he can't believe in God? Or what if he's making this whole argument? What if he made this whole argument and he never believed in God? Man created God in his own image. Everything sucks. I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I mean, in a certain sense, the idea is that, like, it doesn't matter if there's a God, right? If this is if God is such that this is the world he would make, then the proper relationship towards that goal, towards that God, is one of revolt and rejection. I mean, from a it's funny, I admire Yvonne's argument so much, and it's almost from the opposite aspect from Melissa, where it's not the stare in the face of the murdered child stuff, blah blah blah. That's tough. From an argument construction perspective, he's granting everything you could possibly grant, just giving every possible concession to the other side, that not just that there is a God, that there is a plan, that there is a redemptive end of things, and also on the other end he's reducing what he has to prove. He doesn't have to prove that there's no God. It doesn't matter if there's a God. If there is such a God, all he has to prove is that fuck that guy.
Can I quote?
If he exists or not.
Can I quote Spy Kids 2?
Always.
Do you think God stays in heaven because he lives in fear of what he's created? Steve Buscemi's character.
He too is a Karamazov.
That's where more of the question is for me, what Aaron just kind of jokingly said is, the question is for me, and I take Yvonne's argument very seriously, but my one burning question is, or my issue with the argument is, it kind of assumes that children getting shot in the face is God's order. Well, it's not. It's definitely not. That's Satan's order. So that's the question: is how far out of hand or out of control is God's own creation, from him? So that's the question. You just come back to that classic: if God is all loving and all powerful, why isn't this happening? It would seem that the all powerful aspect isn't there, or he's not going there for some reason, probably owing to human freedom. But so for me, that's the burning question: is, okay, obviously the children being tortured, it's not God's order, it's obviously Satan's order. So obviously there's some element here that is sort of out of control, out of God's hands in a sense. Obviously not completely, because all things are sustained and hold together in him, and he hasn't snapped his fingers and made it all just terminate. It's all still going. But
I'm glad that you made this distinction, Brendan. Thank you. Yvonne does not make this distinction at all.
Yeah.
And I think that is partly why he's so troubled. I don't know if it matters. Would he have made this distinction if we pointed it out? Maybe. But I do think in the argument that we are presented with, the suffering of the children is somehow part of the plan.
I hope not.
Well, but I mean, for Yvonne, it's he says this is the fertile soil for someone else's future harmony.
That's the part I disagree with. That's the part where I'm like, no, I definitely can't accept that. What Yvonne is presenting, I'm like, well, no, definitely.
Okay, but this isn't just Yvonne. This is what bothers me, is we all act like that's cool. But even this week in church, I heard homilies and everyone's saying God doesn't give us more than we can handle. There's this tension that's inherent to Christianity, where I don't think anyone I have ever met as a Christian has fully resolved this question. Where on the one hand, we're like, God doesn't give us more than we can handle. None of us can handle being shot in the face. Okay, I'm just saying. And I'm just saying that there is this tension that seems built in, that on the one hand, we want to say it's not God's order, but on the other hand, we do. And I'm saying this as someone who fully believes, after the past few years I've lived through, that the most horrible things can be transformed into an opportunity to come to faith. But again, that's where I come back to this idea. Saying it from the outside often feels hollow and stupid. And that's where I think Yvonne is raising, even if we grant that nuance, there's a real point here, right? Who of us gets to say to a kid that got shot in the face, that's okay, God was able to transform that into your salvation. I'm sorry, shut up. That sucks. That's not a real answer. And I feel again, maybe I think like Taggy had a great point. It was like, maybe all we can do is sit with it. And that's the only answer I've come to. But like sitting with it is miserable. Like sitting with the fact that a kid might get shot in the face and it doesn't mean anything should hurt. And that's where I feel like Alyosha's saying, stop. Like, why are you torturing me? We all should be tortured by this. Like, if really sitting with the unanswerable mystery is the only answer, okay, but that should suck. Like, that's some penance right there. Let's all sit with the fact that everything is miserable and that doesn't mean anything and someday it'll be transformed. But for now, all we can tell a kid getting shot in the face is, sorry, you're going to get shot in the face. Like,
well, and a
ouch.
couple things strike me. One is suffering can be transformative and redemptive, but it's not always, like you just pointed out. And it's not something, again, this is reiterating what you said, it's not something that can be kind of externally enforced. Some people can take their own suffering and turn it into something else, but that is literally not always the case. And then second, I don't know if it matters if the suffering is part of God's plan or part of Satan's plan or whose plan it is, because you still come to the same problem that Yvonne has, which is whether or not it was God's plan. What God and what Christianity is saying is that heaven in the end is going to make it all worth it. And I still don't think it's worth it. So it doesn't matter who came up with the idea of suffering. Like, I still don't think it's worth it in the end.
It's not worth it because the kid had to sleep in the poop outhouse.
And eat it.
Yeah.
You know,
I say that with
it doesn't make it all okay. It doesn't erase the suffering.
Is this a Russian notion?
No.
I don't know. I'm not Russian.
no, it's a super Protestant notion too.
Sorry, carry on.
I mean, you hear that in all sorts of evangelical, revival type stuff. Is that you were paying the price for admission, and that's where I hear the ticket. I hear that in like my grandma's Pentecostalism, that they use verbiage that's very similar to that to describe what dealing with things on earth will yield for you later.
I have a lot of things that I think about this, and if we're to offer any sort of reply to this, I don't really think we're ready for that. But just to highlight a few things Yvonne does and doesn't do, I think one thing he does do is I guess portray the solution at the end as somehow making sense of the things that came in the middle that are terrible. And I don't think that any of us would want to allow for that. And that is where I think Yvonne is being profoundly Christian. And I don't think any of these things add up to something good, no matter how they get morphed in the end. Evil is evil, and it has no meaning ever. And I think that's maybe one of the things Yvonne just really wants to point out, wants to hear someone say. There's nothing that can transform bullshit and make it into gold, This is bullshit. I don't think Christianity disagrees. I do think a lot of people try to skip it and try to say, no, it is good. And you'll understand eventually why. It's like, no, it's not good. Let's not call evil good ever for any reason. And that argument needs to be taken very seriously. And frankly, I side with most atheists and Satanists on this one, I completely understand. Why am I Christian? I don't even know. Like, maybe I'll figure that out in the next chapters. I I don't think Alyosha has a good comeback, but he's sitting with it. He's at least sitting with it. A lot of us don't want to sit with it. I mean, you read these chapters, they're disturbing. I almost wanted to give like a disclaimer before you read this. Like, these are seriously disturbing chapters. We don't normally allow ourselves to be aware of the abject atrocities that are happening. And we maybe think we've advanced beyond this age. This is like a borderline medieval society still in Russia. What Ivan points out is this cruelty is innate in us. Why do we have these tendencies? Why is it so easy for someone to become a baby tossing bayonet stabber? Something's messed up with the fabric of humanity. And I'm like, that's right, dude. I don't know what to say to that. We don't need to reply to that maybe this week, but we got to sit with that, I think.
I think that was my whole point. If I had to make one, it would be like Alyosha's response is exactly on point here. Like, these are unanswerable questions, and unanswerable questions are the worst. They're the worst for someone like Ivan, who's like the intellectual that needs to solve all the answers and needs to have all the answers for everything. And to just sit painfully quiet in such face of some sort of unanswerable question is like hell to him. And so Ivan lives in hell, and he rejects it because he can't live there. He can't sit quietly in this question, and this question is unanswerable. Like, he needs to have an answer for this, and Alyosha can't provide an answer. No one can provide an answer.
Yes, and so I wonder where Ivan plans to go when he returns his ticket. I think that's a great question. Like, so what then, Ivan?
And that's where Camus starts.
Yep, soldier on in your revolt.
And that's also where Satanism starts. Do whatever you want.
All hail the Dark Prince.
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts, but I need to go to bed because I got to teach a class at 8 a.m. So I'm going to tap out right here. So
But
I'm so sorry, but...
Like Ivan says to Alyosha, we have an eternity. We have...
I don't have an eternity. I have 5 hours before I have to get up and go teach some people who don't even know how to write a sentence.
I want to get to know you before I say goodbye.
You have time. We're married. I'm going to go to bed.
My students literally don't know how to pretend. I mean,
I'm teaching English 100 level at the community college. Trust me. Yeah. So we're going to try and write some arguments tomorrow. They aren't going to be anywhere near this sophisticated. So I got to sleep for at least 5 hours before we try to do this.
Hail Satan.
No, hail Satan. No, 0 Satans in my classroom, please. No Satans. So anyway, I'm sorry. I'm loving this conversation, but I gotta tap out for a Monday night.
Thanks, Liz. Anyone else who needs to go can go. We are way over time. We're an hour over here. I want to point out one other interesting dynamic of Ivan here. In his own words, he says, I don't understand and I don't want to understand.
That's why David's just been watching Titanic this 3 hours.
And I think that there's two ways to read that statement. One of which is charitable and one which is not. And the charitable way to read that is probably like to say there is no logic. I reject any logic that would justify the torture of a child, which I agree with completely. The other way to read that is, I'm so troubled by this, I don't care to find any way out of this. I'm in so far in despair, it doesn't matter,
Or it's a way of life at this point. to frame it, I keep coming back to this like living in revolt thing. I think just because that's the kind of discourse that I'm used to. But
well, the chapter is called Rebellion, so
yeah, that too. but he places a real like this is a way of life to some extent, or in some sense. Like you can. I mean, the fact that Ivan has survived and continues to survive a while, no spoilers, is evidence that you can live in rebellion, at least for a while. It's a way. It sucks, but it's a way.
Well, I think it's more of the latter. Like, I don't think there's anyone that could tell me like any other thing that could possibly like justify it. Like, I've been through every single potential end and thought them through. Like, there's no way you can convince me otherwise that like this is a good thing. Like, he's fully convinced in his own path. That's the way I read it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask again, what is his path?
Rebellion.
So this might be a completely incorrect reading because, you know, I'm a person who has not read the rest of the book, so I'll probably be proved wrong in about 3 pages. But is there any chance, we keep talking about returning the ticket and going in rebellion, is there any chance that instead of rejecting God and turning to, like, you know, dog eat dog world, do whatever you want, get power, get money because it doesn't matter, is there a way to rebel the other direction and be like, I'm going to be a good person and I'm not going to shoot children in the face, but I'm not going to expect a heavenly reward?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Is there anything in that?
Yeah, and well, I mean, he's about to tell us in the next chapter an alternate idea, maybe. And from the beginning, he kind of pointed out socialism and this are approaching the same questions from the other end. So maybe that's part of it. I think there probably is a way to, and this is where, like, again, when I say, like, I'm on the side of Satanists and atheists who raise these questions, maybe they're being more Christian than the Christians when they raise these questions, because they're like, evil is completely unacceptable under any circumstances for any reason, you know? And if that's the order of things, I say, screw the order of things, you know? I think the problem is there's no necessity to take the good path. You can just as equally well take the path of self-destruction, despair, and, you know, domineering over other people. Why should I choose the good path? You know, that's an open question that I think we reach at the end of this dilemma. Melissa's cheering in the hallway for all what you guys said.
Well, doesn't the question, why should I choose the good path, kind of assume that this is God's order and I'm really rebelling against God? If you go back to saying, okay, there's an order of the God of this world, right? Satan and the fallen powers and principalities, and then there's an order of God, and then in that sense, the rebellion can be the most Christian thing you do. If you rebel against, you know, this order of suffering, you're really not rebelling against the God of love, you're rebelling against the God of this world. I mean, is that a moot point or what?
Well, I think it's an interesting question of who you're rebelling against and what you're rebelling against. Like how do we define order in the first place? I think that
Because
that's a big question.
I'm not willing to say that the kids being torn apart is God's order, but it is a lowercase g God's order. You know, the God of this world, if you will. You know, you can make that spiritual or you can make it anthropological. You know, wars and, you know, whatever passions of the flesh that drive people to kill each other. Rebelling against that order, and kind of to Ginny's point is, rebelling against that order, and then living according to, the Sermon on the Mount, and your rebellion going that way. But that assumes, to have that, you have to be assuming, okay, there's one order that's God's, but we're not seeing it on earth. There's another order we're seeing on earth, it's not God's. Now, there's still the problem, why is that? Why is God's order not on earth? If he can make that happen, why doesn't he? But absolutely, I agree that, evil is always evil. There's no good point to suffering. There's no cute answer you can give in the face of it. I don't know, just my thoughts. No real conclusion to that.
Mick G, do you think that you can read Ivan, because you said there are two readings of, I refuse to understand, or I don't want to understand. Don't you think in the emotion of the chapter, the charitable reading that don't you think that's the one that really corresponds with the mood of the section? I have a lot of difficulty not having the charitable reading just because of the emotion and all of the context. No, I'm saying I just can't. I don't see how the other reading can have considering this is all about the children. It would seem to me that would have to be the reading, the charitable reading would have to be the reading of what he says.
Well, I think I'm not sure. I think his heart is clearly troubled by all this, and that's a really weak way of stating it. He clearly identifies with them. I think we should probably go with the charitable reading, but let's see how he lives his life and see which direction he takes.
I would interject if I'm not interrupting your thought.
No, I pretty much, that was garbage. I completely lost. I have no good response. I just lost it.
Considering that as we've discussed, Ivan is full of conflict and contradictory statements and contradictory feelings and thoughts and everything in conflict. I could almost see both readings of that. Yes, the charitable, the more logical side, as we're saying, and then also just the I can't deal with this. I don't want an answer because I can't deal with this. Speaking for myself, I have days where I'm probably one or the other. It's not necessarily always even the same reasoning even when you're saying the same thing. It's not always for the same reason.
I wonder if Ivan has even realized that there is no answer to this, and it's if you try to tell me an answer, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, I for sure think that's part of it.
I think he always has the Karamazov option of, if things don't make sense, there's always sensuality. Enjoy life until you're 30, and then it's just, I'm tired of this place. I don't know exactly what he plans to do with the cup, but
gross.
It seems to me that he's entertaining the option of pure narcissism like his father, but maybe just don't go as far as he does into, because it's just distasteful.
But why? Why for Ivan would that be distasteful?
Well, just because it's revolting.
Why? Why is it revolting?
Because I think that's just Ivan's response. It's his sensual response, whether he wants it to be or not. He's revolted.
But how does he formulate that revulsion?
Well, I don't know how he would formulate it, but I know he knows he feels it.
Yeah, he hates his father, and he's expressed his disgust with the idea of ride this thing out till 80. But he seems to be okay with it till 30, whatever that means.
Like, but that's a huge apparent like distinction between him and his father. Like, I'm wondering why that's the case.
I think it's just I don't know, his sense of this is more noble. There's some sense of human dignity, and my father is the, vilest expression of what a human could ever do. So I don't want to be that. But
do you think it's in pure
essentially-
contrast? Like, well, I will be like my father until 30 instead of 80. Like, that's a huge distinction. Or is it like it's some sort of weird arbitrary thing, but he's got some reason behind it? Like, Ivan is not a person of non-reason. Like,
Yes, he doesn't just. Yes, he is. He portrays himself as a person of reason, but he's conflicted and contradictory, and impulsive sometimes, like Katerina.
Like, is he just throwing this out of a hat, though? I mean, like, is there any sort of intellectual, like, thought pattern behind this? Like, I don't know.
I don't know either, Michael. I'm just stating an option for him that I think he keeps on the table. I don't know if he's made up his mind or understands why.
I think like the thing is that even if Ivan decided to go the route of narcissism, it was still not resemble his father's, right? Because we all know there's a difference between an asshole and a sophisticated asshole, right? Like,
that's it.
I mean, like we know that there's a difference, and he's disgusted by his father's narcissism and his lack of sophistication, but he's more disgusted by his father's lack of sophistication than he is by his narcissism.
That's so well put.
But how does he base it? Like, I'm just wondering, like, does he base it based on intellectual, like, levels or, like, contemporary peers? Or what's the biggest distinction between him and his father that creates this huge rift in their, like, trajectories? Like,
maybe there's not such a big distinction. That's why he hates him so much.
Well,
the parts of himself that he sees in him, and he's disgusted by it. But it's in his father, it's clear and repulsive, and in him, it's latent and undecided.
Well, the distinction is his father compromises his identity, and he feels like he doesn't have an identity because he's abandoned. And I feel like, I'm not being Freud here. I think this whole religious thing is still ultimately about his identity and the father thing. And again, I'm not trying to be Freud, and I'm not trying to make an escape, but Ivan doesn't know who he is. And the thing is when you say, what does it mean to take the ticket back? What does it mean to rebel against the identity of being the son of Fyodor Karamazov? What does it mean to rebel against the identity of being the son of a Christian god?
Well,
like these are all things that
who is
going
Fyodor?
together.
Who is Fyodor? Does he even have an identity, or is he this like shapeshifter?
Well, but the thing is, to Ivan, who Fyodor is not dictated by who Fyodor actually is, but by the wound that Fyodor has given Ivan. That's the point. Like, that's the point. Like, so Ivan, like when I said I think this is about fatherhood, I wasn't saying Ivan's points are unreasonable. I think they're completely reasonable. I think based upon his own personal experience, he sees the world the only way he can see the world. He is, based upon his experience and his intellect, everything makes sense. Everything completely corresponds with his experience. And his experience of his father is, this is the man who abandoned me. This is the man who made me feel worthless. This is the man who made me feel like I had to earn my way in the world so that all my value is totally performative.
This is the one who had to make me suffer.
And exactly. And that's the thing. So when he's talking about God, what he's really saying is, I'm talking about the one who's responsible for my situation, but not only my situation, but the situation of the world being so fucked up.
I think that's probably, I think that's a piece of it. Obviously, we're all our experiences and the way our worldview is shaped as children largely. But I think it's really reductive to say that that's the entire reason.
Well,
Yes.
no, but but I think the reason why it's important is because that's the difference between Ivan and Alyosha. The reason why I make it like the big
One of
thing,
the differences.
well,
yeah.
but I think it's the primary one. I think it's the one that really, because it's when people talk about how lenses bend the same light in different ways. I feel like that's the thing that really is where the light breaks between the two of them. Because I actually think the biggest contradiction of it is not that Ivan says it's impossible for a man to love another man. I think what the biggest contradiction is Ivan, although he may not admit it, loves Alyosha.
Hmm.
And I see that, and that's the thing. Like, I feel like I'm a huge Ivan fan. Ivan is actually my favorite character in all of literature. So I thought it was funny that, like, if it seems like I'm anti-Ivan, I think that's really strange. Ivan is actually my favorite character. And that's the thing. Like, I feel like the big difference is that Ivan has this very particular wound that if he did not have it, he would be a lot more similar to Alyosha than we would ever imagine. Like, I really do. I think that wound and that difficulty of loving and that difficulty of vulnerability and that option for power over love, I feel like that's the primary fork in the road between those two brothers.
In their experiences, yes, but that doesn't take into account the different personalities, different, like talking earlier about whether Alyosha's path in life is a decision or a personality trait or a gift or some other way you want to phrase it. I mean, siblings are going to be different, even if they have the exact same experiences. I'm not trying to completely negate what you're saying. Experience is important. It's just not the only thing.
Well, I'm just saying that, like, if you think about it, right, they both love each other and they both have the deep passion for justice, right? Like, in fact, almost everything that's going on in their argument that's happening is not the fact that the reason why it's such a difficult question is not that the brothers disagree, but they actually agree. But they're still seeing it differently through different lenses. But they actually agree.
That's interesting. Like that.
Bingo.
Thought. I really want to know what McGee and Melissa are talking about now while he's muted. I just happened to notice. Having a little side conversation.
See, I can't see because I had to go like just audio because like my feed could not be maintained with my crappy internet connection with video.
Because you're watching Titanic.
I will have you know that I have never watched Titanic.
That's a disappointment.
Yeah, you're missing out.
Guys, we have already descended to pure socialism. We're way deep, way over time. Hopefully what we've established is this is very uncomfortable and we don't agree. And if that's the case, then everything is going according to plan.
And the Grand Inquisitor will sort everything out.
I really thank everybody, I think, for their thoughts and insights. It's been very enlightening to read this through the perspective of many different eyes. And I feel like that really deepened my appreciation for these chapters. I'm looking forward to reading the next section with you guys, especially the Grand Inquisitor, where Ivan's like, oh, let me talk about Jesus Christ for a second, now that you bring that up. So we'll do this next week. Again, it's a pretty short section. It's only half the book. We're going to mostly focus on that one chapter. So maybe read that one twice. I think this is where Ivan gets very interesting and confusing and like, what is he all about? So I'm curious to hear what you make of his next argument in light of this one, because they seem, do they connect? I don't know. So I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast. And if anyone wants to chat, you can. Thanks so much for joining.